Marceline is floating upside down in her house, bass guitar slung across her chest, eating the red off a strawberry and leaving the rest to fall toward a ceiling that might as well be the floor. She's done this for 1,000 years. Same house, same bass, same floating. Different strawberry. She looks 17. She's been 17 for longer than your great-great-great-grandparents were alive. That's the thing about Marceline the Vampire Queen that nobody tells you up front. She's the oldest person in you, stuck in the body and emotional state of someone who should be worrying about prom, not the heat death of the sun. She's witnessed the apocalypse, survived the collapse of human civilization, and watched entire kingdoms rise from candy and bubblegum, and yet she still gets annoyed when someone eats her fries. Because immortality doesn't make you wise, it just makes you old and tired. So incredibly tired. But let's rewind, because there's a story here that stretches back before the Land of Oo had a name, before the Candy Kingdom existed, before the Ice King was the Ice King. A story about a little girl with a stuffed animal, a crown that stole someone's mind, and a bass guitar that became the only constant in a life that refused to end. Marceline doesn't drink blood anymore. That's important. That's the detail everyone fixates on when they first meet her. Wait, you're a vampire who doesn't drink blood? What do you drink, smoothies? And yes, actually, she does drink smoothies. Red smoothies. She sucks the colour red out of things because somewhere along her immortal timeline, she made a choice that changed the trajectory of her entire existence. She decided that consuming life, even in the abstract vampiric way, wasn't who she wanted to be. Even if being a vampire was the only reason she survived this long. You want to understand Marceline? Start with the contradictions. She's a demon's daughter who chooses kindness, a vampire queen who gave up blood, a 1,000-year-old warrior who still sleeps with a stuffed animal when she thinks nobody's watching. She's punk rock and vulnerable, terrifying and tender, and she's spent centuries building walls around herself that she desperately wants someone to climb. Her house is a cave, not metaphorically, literally a cave carved into a mountain, decorated with the debris of a dead world. Furniture from the pre-war era that should be in a museum. Posters for bands that don't exist anymore because everyone in them is dust. A photo booth strip, faded and precious, tucked in a drawer she pretends she doesn't check every few weeks. Evidence of lives lived and lost, all curated by someone who can't die, but also can't move on. She floats because vampires float. Because gravity is optional when you're undead royalty. But also because staying grounded requires a kind of commitment to the present that Marceline's never quite managed. It's easier to drift, easier to hover between the ceiling and floor, between engagement and detachment, between the person she was and the person she's become. The bass guitar never leaves her side. It's an axe, actually. Her father's axe, repurposed into an instrument because Marceline has always been better at creating than destroying, even when destruction is her birthright. She plays it when she's happy, when she's sad, when she's processing emotions she doesn't have names for because they're specific to living forever. 3 chords, and the truth. Except the truth is complicated when you've lived through 1,000 different versions of yourself. Music is how Marceline remembers. Not just the past, but how to feel about the past. Every song is a memory crystallized, a moment preserved in melody that won't fade the way human recollection does. She's forgotten plenty. Centuries blur, faces merge, conversations dissolve. But she's never forgotten a song. The songs stay, especially the one Simon taught her. But we'll get to Simon. We'll get to the man who saved her life and lost his mind, to the deteriorating relationship between a little girl and her surrogate father, to the letters and the photographs and the unbearable weight of being remembered by someone who can't quite remember themselves. We'll get to the tragedy that defined her, the loss that shaped her, the love that never got the ending it deserved. Right now, we're in her house. And she's playing a riff that sounds melancholic until she bends it into something defiant. Because that's Marceline's whole existence in miniature, taking sadness and making it sharp enough to fight with. She's the Vampire Queen, which sounds impressive until you realise she's the Vampire Queen of precisely 0 vampires, because she killed them all. Hunted them down one by one, absorbed their essences, claimed their powers, and ended their immortal lives because that's what you do when you're a traumatised kid with demon strength and a score to settle. Self-defence, she'd say. Survival. necessary violence in a world that was already violent. But here's the thing the title doesn't tell you. Being queen of nothing is lonelier than you'd think. Ooh doesn't make sense. Not by pre-war standards. Not by any standards, really. It's a land of candy people and lumpy space princesses, of sentient video game consoles and despotic rulers made of bubblegum. Magic works here because reality broke so thoroughly that the rules had to be rewritten. The Mushroom War didn't just end civilization. It cracked open possibility itself, let weird seep through the fissures, turned Earth into a fever dream that occasionally remembers it used to be a planet. Marceline predates most of it. She watched become ooh, watched the mutations, the magic, the slow reassembly of society into something unrecognizable. She's the closest thing to a historical record that isn't actively insane or made of candy, and she doesn't talk about it much because what's the point? The past is dead. She's just the one who won't die with it. She met Princess Bubblegum 800 years ago, give or take a few decades. Bonnie was building a kingdom from scratch, animating candy through scientific principles that bent toward magic, creating life because she could, because someone had to, because the world was empty and she refused to let it stay that way. Marceline was impressed. Marceline was intrigued. Marceline fell hard for a pink princess who looked at the apocalypse and decided to build a civilization in its ashes. They were together for a while. Then they weren't. Then they were friends. Then they weren't that either. Then centuries passed and neither of them dealt with it properly, because when you're immortal, you can avoid your ex for 300 years and barely notice the time passing. Their relationship is complicated in the way that centuries-long entanglements between emotionally stunted immortals tend to be. There's love there, definitely love, but it's love that's been buried under hurt and misunderstanding and the fundamental incompatibility of Bubblegum's need for control meeting Marceline's need for chaos. They're opposites who attract and repel in equal measure, and they've spent the better part of a millennium figuring out whether the attraction outweighs the repulsion. Spoiler, it does. But that revelation takes time, and pain, and a willingness to be vulnerable that neither of them came by naturally. Marceline writes songs about it. About her, about them. Songs she performs for audiences and songs she only plays alone at 3 a.m. when the loneliness gets specific. The music is honest in ways Marceline often isn't, excavating feelings she'd rather keep buried, transforming pain into power chords and longing into lyrics that hit harder than they should. She wrote a song called I'm Just Your Problem that's ostensibly about being a nuisance but actually about begging someone to see you, to acknowledge that your hurt matters, to stop being so rational about emotions that demand irrationality. She performed it at Bubblegum. The subtext was text. Nobody missed it. They still didn't talk about it for another few seasons. That's the Marceline way. Express everything through music. Bury everything else under sarcasm and floating and pretending she doesn't care. Caring is dangerous when everyone you've ever cared about either dies or forgets you. Better to keep people at axe base length. Better to be the cool vampire who doesn't need anyone, except she does need people, desperately. That's the secret underneath the leather jacket and the fangs and the devil-may-care attitude. Marceline is fundamentally, catastrophically lonely, and she's spent 1,000 years trying to figure out how to connect with others without the inevitable pain of losing them. Her father doesn't count. Hunson Abadir, Lord of the Nightosphere, Eater of Souls, Demon King of Chaos. He's technically her dad, and he technically loves her in his own emotionally incompetent demonic way. But he's also the kind of father who eats your fries after you explicitly asked him not to, and doesn't understand why you're upset. He gave her the axe, he gave her demon powers, he gave her immortality through his blood. He didn't give her a functional parent-child relationship, but honestly, what were the odds of that working out when one parent is the literal embodiment of chaotic evil? She doesn't rule the Nightosphere despite being heir to it. Doesn't want that throne, that power, that inheritance. Being half-demon is burden enough without accepting dominion over the realm of tormented souls. She's spent her existence rejecting what her father represents, while being unable to fully escape it. The demon blood runs through her. The potential for destruction is always there. She just chooses, every day, not to be him. That choice matters. That choice is who Marceline is. Finn and Jake stumbled into her life the way they stumble into everything, accidentally, enthusiastically, without reading the room. Two heroes on an adventure who found a vampire queen and decided she was just another person to befriend. Which she was. Which she'd forgotten she could be. Finn reminds her of herself, weirdly. Not the specific details. He's an optimistic human hero and she's a pessimistic demon vampire. But the core truth of him. The trying. The believing that being good matters even when the world makes it hard. Finn chooses heroism the way Marceline chose to stop drinking blood, deliberately and against his nature. Humans are violent. Heroes are complicated. Finn is both and also genuinely kind, and Marceline sees in him the person she might have been if the apocalypse hadn't happened, if Simon hadn't gone mad, if she'd been allowed to just be a kid. She's protective of him in ways she doesn't articulate, mentoring without calling it mentoring, showing him that being a hero sometimes means being vulnerable, that strength includes knowing when to cry, that the sword doesn't solve everything. She's teaching him lessons she learned the hard way, hoping he can learn them easier. Jake's just fun. He's silly and loyal and makes her laugh, which is rarer than you'd think for someone who's existed as long as Marceline has. Comedy gets stale when you've heard every joke and seen every punchline coming centuries before the setup. But Jake's randomness, his genuine weirdness, his complete comfort with absurdity, it works. He makes Ooh feel less like a nightmare she's trapped in, and more like a strange dream she's choosing to inhabit. They're her friends. She has friends. After 1,000 years of survival and isolation, she has an adventurer and a magic dog who visit her house and care whether she's okay. It shouldn't be revolutionary. It is. BMO calls her Marceline in that earnest robot voice and asks her to play songs, and she does, because who can say no to BMO? Not Marceline. Nobody can say no to BMO. That's just science. But underneath the friendships and the floating and the bass guitar, underneath the casual immortality and the vampire powers and the ex-girlfriend tension, there's a question Marceline hasn't answered. What do you do when you've lived long enough to become everyone you've ever been, and none of those people are who you want to be? She's been a scared kid, a survivor, a hunter, a queen, a wanderer, a friend, a daughter, a girlfriend, a musician, a monster, a hero. She's accumulated identities the way others accumulate memories, layering them one atop another until she can't remember which one is real. Maybe they're all real. Maybe that's the point. Maybe immortality isn't about becoming someone. It's about accepting that you're everyone you've ever been simultaneously all the time, and learning to live with the contradiction. Or maybe she just needs therapy. Probably both. The sun setting over Ooh, painting the Candy Kingdom in shades of strawberry and cream, Ice Kingdom to the north, glittering and cold, lumpy space somewhere in the dimensional vicinity being lumpy. The grasslands stretch out below her mountain, green and peaceful, hiding all manner of weird beneath their pleasant surface. This is home. This is the world she's protected and ignored in equal measure, the land she's older than but younger than she feels. Marceline floats to her window and looks out at the kingdom made of bubblegum, at the castle where a pink princess is probably working late, probably solving some crisis through science and determination, probably not thinking about the vampire who used to make her laugh, probably thinking about her exactly as much as Marceline's thinking about her. She picks up her bass, plays a few notes, nothing specific, just sound, just the vibration of strings converting emotion into something the air can carry. Before she was the Vampire Queen, before the floating and the crown and the axe base, Marceline was just a little girl trying to survive the end of the world. Just a kid who needed someone to tell her everything would be okay, even when it obviously wouldn't be. She found that someone. She lost him to magic and madness, and that loss, that's where everything begins. Every immortal has a beginning, even if they've forgotten most of it. Marceline was born half demon, half human, which sounds like the setup to a joke, except the punchline is 1,000 years of identity crisis. Her father is Hunson Abadir, Lord of the Nightosphere, a being of pure chaotic evil who rules a dimension of suffering with the casual indifference of someone who genuinely doesn't understand why that might be a problem. Her mother was human, fully, ordinarily, beautifully human, mortal, breakable, gone. We don't know her mother's name. Adventure Time never tells us, and maybe that's the point. Marceline has lived so long that the most important person in her early life has become a feeling rather than a fact. A warmth she remembers without details, a presence that shaped her more than any demon power ever could. Her mother is a gap in the narrative that Marceline has spent centuries trying not to fill with idealization or grief, or the crushing weight of being the only one left who remembers she existed. But she was there, she was real. She fell in love with a demon lord, which raises questions about her judgment, but also speaks to something Marceline understands intrinsically. Sometimes you're drawn to chaos. Sometimes the dangerous thing makes you feel alive. Sometimes you look at the embodiment of evil and think, I can fix him. And then you can't fix him, obviously, but you have a kid with him anyway because humans are optimistic like that. Or maybe Hudson was different then. Maybe he tried. Maybe before he was the soul-sucking ruler of torment, he was just a powerful entity who thought fatherhood might be interesting in the way someone thinks skydiving might be interesting. Worth trying once. Probably won't stick with it long term. Marceline got her mother's empathy and her father's immortality, which is either the best or worst combination depending on how you feel about caring deeply about people you're going to outlive by millennia. She got her mother's moral compass and her father's capacity for destruction. She got a human heart in a demon's body, or maybe a demon's power in a human soul. The duality has never resolved itself cleanly, and she stopped trying to figure out which half wins. They both win, they both lose. She's both things, simultaneously, all the time. The Nightosphere is where her father rules, and it's exactly as terrible as you'd imagine a hell dimension to be. All suffering and chaos, souls in various states of torment, demons cackling about demon things, Hudson sitting on his throne looking vaguely bored by the whole operation. It runs itself, mostly. Evil doesn't need micromanagement when it's self-sustaining. Marceline visited exactly once as a kid. Her father wanted to show her what she'd inherit, the kingdom that would be hers if she just embraced her demon nature and stopped being so hung up on morality and other human weaknesses. He showed her the souls, the suffering, the power. He thought she'd be impressed. She was horrified. Because that's the thing about being raised by a human mother. You develop this inconvenient trait called empathy. You start thinking about suffering as something that matters. You look at souls in torment and think, that's bad, instead of that's Tuesday. Her mother taught her kindness, probably without meaning to, probably just by being herself. By singing to her, by holding her when she was scared, by showing her that love doesn't have to be transactional or violent or contingent on power. Hudson didn't understand it then, barely understands it now. The axe was his attempt at connection, years later, after everything had already fallen apart. A weapon from the Nightosphere, powerful and chaotic, an heirloom of destruction passed from father to daughter. Here, this is yours, this is what I can give you. Take my violence and make something of it. And Marceline took it, because it was the only thing her father knew how to offer, and she turned it into a bass guitar because she's her mother's daughter first. She made an instrument of destruction into an instrument of creation. That's the thesis of her entire existence right there. Before the bombs, before the apocalypse, before everything changed, Marceline was just a kid, maybe 7 years old, maybe younger. Time gets fuzzy when you're remembering a childhood from 1,000 years away. She lived with her mother in a world that was teetering on the edge but hadn't fallen yet. Pre-war Earth, with its cities and its humans and its conflicts that seemed important, until actual annihilation put them in perspective. Her mother knew what Marceline was, had to know. You don't have a kid with the Lord of the Nightosphere and expect a normal child. But she loved her anyway, fiercely, the way mothers love their children even when those children have demon blood and concerning abilities that manifest at inappropriate times. Did Marceline's mother know the world was ending? Did she see the signs, the escalating tensions, the militarization, the inevitability? Or was the mushroom war as sudden for her as it was for everyone else? One moment you're living your life, the next moment the sky's falling and everything you know is burning? Marceline remembers fragments. Her mother's voice. The lullabies that weren't quite right because her mother couldn't carry a tune but sang anyway. Because what else do you do when your daughter can't sleep? The way she smelled like something floral that Marceline can't name anymore because those flowers don't exist in Ooh. The feeling of being held, of being safe, of being loved without condition or complication. She remembers the last day, the sirens, the panic. Her mother grabbing her, telling her to be brave, telling her everything would be okay, in that way adults lie to children when they know it won't be. The sky turning colours that skies shouldn't turn. The sound of the world ending, which is louder and quieter than you'd expect. Explosions in the distance, screaming nearby, and underneath it all, a terrible silence where normalcy used to be. Her mother had Hambo. A stuffed animal, worn and loved, something from Marceline's early childhood that had survived being dragged everywhere. Her mother pressed it into her hands and told her to hold on to it, to keep it safe, to remember. Remember what? Marceline would wonder later. Remember her? Remember the world before? Remember that she was loved? All of it. All of the above. The Mushroom War took everything. Cities, civilizations, most of humanity, the basic structure of reality itself. It broke the world so thoroughly that magic leaked in through the cracks, that radiation and mutation became the new normal, that the planet Earth transformed into something unrecognizable. But before all that, before the transformation and the weird and the land of Ooh rising from the ashes, there was just a mother and daughter trying to survive something unsurvivable. And then her mother was gone. Not immediately, not in the blast, but gone in the way that matters, separated, lost, consumed by the chaos of the end times. Did she die in the initial attack, in the aftermath, years later from radiation? Marceline doesn't know, never found out, never found a body or a grave or confirmation. Her mother just stopped being there one day, and no amount of demon power could bring her back or even tell Marceline what happened. That absence defined her. That loss shaped everything she'd become. Because Marceline learned, very early and very permanently, that everyone leaves, everyone dies. Love is temporary, and attachment is just pain waiting to happen. Better to keep moving, better to not care too much, better to be the one who survives, even if survival means carrying a hole where your family used to be. She kept Hambo for centuries, a stuffed animal lasting longer than civilizations, outliving species, remaining intact while the world transformed around it. Magic helped, probably. Her demon nature preserving what mattered even when she couldn't preserve the person who mattered most. Hambo was her connection to when she was just a kid with a mum who loved her, before she had to become a survivor, a warrior, a vampire queen. When she eventually lost Hambo, traded it away in a moment of desperation for something she needed more, it broke something in her she thought was already broken. Turned out you could lose the same thing twice. First the person, then the symbol of the person. Grief has layers like that. You think you've processed it, and then you lose the stuffed animal, and suddenly you're 7 years old again, watching your mother disappear into the apocalypse. Princess Bubblegum got it back for her. Travelled to a witch, made a deal, retrieved Hambo from someone who didn't understand what it meant. Brought it back to Marceline without fanfare, just handed it over like it was no big deal, like crossing dimensions and negotiating with a powerful magical being was just a casual favour between friends. That's when Marceline knew. That's when she understood that maybe, possibly, after 800 years of being certain that love was temporary and everyone leaves, there might be someone who understood what it meant to hold on to the past. Someone who understood that a stuffed animal wasn't a stuffed animal. It was the last piece of a mother's love, the last evidence that someone had cared whether she lived or died. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We're still in the before times, in the world that doesn't exist anymore, with a little girl who's about to learn that being half demon means you survive things that kill everyone else. Lucky her. Hudson wasn't there when the bombs fell, obviously. He was in the nightosphere doing demon things, ruling his dimension, completely disconnected from the human realm where his daughter was living with her mother. Did he know about the war? Did he care? Would he have done anything if he'd known his kid was about to experience the apocalypse? Probably not. Hudson operates on a different moral framework than humans, than even demons who occasionally interact with humanity. He's pure chaos, pure self-interest, pure confusion about why anyone would prioritize anything over their own amusement. He loves Marceline in his way, but his way is deeply, fundamentally inadequate. His way involves grand gestures and zero emotional availability, gifts instead of presence, power instead of protection. He gave her immortality through his blood, which means she was already aging slowly, already different from other kids, already marked as something other than human, Did her mother worry about that? About raising a child who wouldn't grow normally, who'd outlive her by eons, who'd eventually have to figure out what it means to be eternal? Of course she worried, but she loved her anyway. That's what mothers do. The demon-human duality wasn't just about powers or abilities, it was about belonging. Marceline didn't fit with demons because she had empathy, conscience, a soul that cared about more than consumption and chaos. But she didn't fit with humans either, because she wasn't mortal, wasn't limited, had abilities that marked her as other. She was caught between two worlds, belonging to neither, too human for the Nightosphere and too demonic for Earth. That in-between space became her identity. Not demon, not human, but something else, something undefined. She made her home in the gap between categories, in the space where definitions break down. It's lonely there. It's also free. Her father thought he was giving her a gift, the power to survive, to endure, to outlast everything. He didn't understand he was cursing her. Or maybe he understood and didn't care. Or maybe in his demonic logic, survival is always a gift regardless of the cost. When you're immortal chaos, you don't think about psychological consequences. You don't think about what it does to a person to watch everyone they love age and die while they stay frozen, to accumulate loss until loss is your primary identity. Hunson gave her forever. Her mother gave her a reason to want forever to be worth living. Guess which one mattered more? The Nightosphere remained an option, technically. Marceline could have gone there after her mother died, could have sought refuge with her father, could have embraced her demonic inheritance and ruled alongside him. She had the power, had the birthright, had every reason to retreat to a dimension where she'd fit, where her immortality was normal, where suffering was just the background noise of existence. She didn't. She stayed on Earth as it transformed into... stayed in the rubble and radiation, survived the mutations and the monsters, chose the destroyed human world over the intact demon dimension, because that's where her mother had lived. That's where the last place she'd been loved existed, even if that place was now a radioactive wasteland populated by candy people and magic. Home isn't where you're from, it's where you choose to stay. Marceline chose Earth, chose humanity's remnants over demon perfection, chose her mother's legacy over her father's kingdom, and that choice, made by a traumatized kid in the aftermath of apocalypse, determined everything that came after. Every relationship, every song, every moment of floating in her house and pretending she's fine, it all traces back to that decision to stay, to remain, to keep being human even when being human was the harder path. Her father visits sometimes, shows up unannounced, eats her fries, doesn't understand why she's upset about the fries, tries to connect in his deeply insufficient way, wants her to take over the Nightosphere, to embrace her destiny, to stop wasting her immortality on feelings and friendships and other mortal concerns, can't comprehend why his daughter would choose emotional complexity over eternal power. Marceline keeps saying no, keeps rejecting the inheritance, keeps being her mother's daughter instead of her father's heir. That's the rebellion. That's the punk rock. Not the leather jacket or the bass guitar or the floating. It's the fundamental refusal to be what she was born to be. It's choosing love over power, vulnerability over invincibility, music over destruction. It's turning her father's axe into an instrument and playing songs that would make her mother proud. The last memory is fuzzy now, worn by time and trauma. Her mother's face, already fading in Marceline's memory even though she tries to hold it. The moment before the separation, before the chaos, before everything went wrong. Her mother telling her she loved her. Her mother promising everything would be okay. Her mother lying kindly, the way you lie to children when the truth is too terrible. And then she was gone, and Marceline was alone, and the world was ending, and 7-year-old half-demon girl was left to figure out survival, with nothing but a stuffed animal and the fading echo of lullabies sung off-key. That's where Marceline begins. Not with vampires or kingdoms or centuries of accumulated trauma, with a little girl who lost her mother to the apocalypse and never quite figured out how to stop losing her. Everything else, the Vampire Queen, the bass guitar, the floating and the fighting and the careful distance from everyone who tries to love her, it's all just elaborate grief management. It's all just a girl trying to remember what it felt like to be held by someone who thought she was worth saving, before the world decided otherwise. The apocalypse doesn't come with instructions. Marceline was 7 years old, give or take, when the sky turned the wrong colours and stayed that way. Old enough to understand that something terrible was happening. Young enough to not fully grasp that terrible meant permanent, that the world wasn't going to reset itself like a bad dream, that her mother wasn't coming back, that this was just reality now, smoke and rubble and the persistent chemical taste of air that had been fundamentally altered at the molecular level. The immediate aftermath was chaos without narrative. No story arc, no hero's journey, just survival in its most basic and brutal form. Find food, find shelter, avoid the things that want to kill you, which was most things because post-apocalyptic Earth was aggressively hostile to continued existence. She had Hambo. That mattered more than it should have. A stuffed animal doesn't provide calories or protection, doesn't keep you warm or fight off mutants, but it was the only constant in a world where every constant had dissolved. At night, in whatever rubble she'd claimed for shelter, she'd hold Hambo and try to remember her mother's voice. Try to remember the lullabies. Try to remember what it felt like when the world made sense. The memories were already fading even then. That's the cruel thing about childhood trauma. Your brain is still developing, still forming its understanding of how memory works, and then something catastrophic happens, and suddenly you're trying to hold on to the most important moments of your life, with a cognitive system that wasn't designed for that kind of weight. She could remember feelings better than facts. Her mother's warmth, but not her face. The safety of being held, but not the specific words spoken. Love as sensation rather than detail. Hambo became the anchor. If she had Hambo, she had proof that before existed. That she hadn't always been this. A kid alone in the ruins, scavenging and surviving and trying not to think about what survival meant long term. The world was unrecognizable. Cities were crater fields. Forests were ash. The sky had a permanent sickly quality, like reality itself was infected. And everywhere, the signs of what had happened. Bodies, mostly, in various states of decay. Remnants of civilization that served as tombstones for the species that built them. Cars frozen in mid-evacuation. Buildings collapsed into themselves. Evidence of panic preserved in rubble. Marceline learned to navigate it. Had to. Her demon constitution meant she could survive things that would kill a normal human. Higher tolerance for radiation. Faster healing. Strength beyond what a 7-year-old should possess. But she was still a kid. Still scared. Still fundamentally alone in a way that 7-year-olds shouldn't be capable of understanding but somehow was. She got good at being quiet, at moving through ruins without attracting attention, at finding the canned goods that hadn't been looted yet, the water sources that weren't completely poisoned, the shelter spots that weren't already claimed by something bigger and meaner. Survival skills learned through trial and error, where error meant nearly dying, and trial meant trying not to nearly die next time. The loneliness was worse than the hunger, worse than the fear, worse than the physical reality of living in a dead world. She was the only kid left as far as she could tell. Everyone else her age was gone, dead in the initial blasts, dead in the aftermath, dead from radiation or starvation, or the 1,000 other ways the post-apocalypse killed its inhabitants. She'd see adults occasionally, survivors trying to carve out existence in impossible conditions, but they didn't want a kid slowing them down. Couldn't afford the extra mouth to feed. Saw her demon features, her too sharp teeth, her ability to survive things that killed others, and decided she wasn't worth the risk. So she survived alone. A little girl with a stuffed animal, wandering through the corpse of human civilization, eating whatever she could find and sleeping wherever seemed safest, and trying very hard not to think about the fact that this might be forever. That this might just be her life now, indefinitely, without end or improvement or hope. Then she met Simon. It was winter in the ruins, which meant everything was grey and frozen, and even more hostile than usual. Marceline had found a semi-intact building, was trying to break into what looked like it might have been a store when she heard singing. Actual singing. A human voice carrying a melody through the devastation, which was so unexpected, so impossible, that she thought she might be hallucinating. She followed the sound. Simon Petrikov was sitting in the wreckage, wearing a crown that looked like it was made of ice, singing to himself while he sorted through canned goods. He looked professorial even in the apocalypse. Glasses, gentle features, The kind of face that suggested he'd spent his pre-war life in libraries and lecture halls rather than combat zones. He was older, middle-aged maybe, with a kind of weathered kindness that suggested he'd been trying very hard to maintain his humanity, while the world insisted humanity was obsolete. He saw her watching, smiled, said hello like they were meeting at a grocery store instead of in the radioactive ashes of civilization. Marceline almost ran. Should have run. Strangers were dangerous, adults were especially dangerous, and something about the crown he wore made her demon instincts scream warnings. But she was so tired, so hungry, so desperately, achingly lonely, and he was smiling at her like she was a person instead of a problem. She didn't run. That decision changed both their lives in ways neither could have predicted. Simon would save her, protect her, become the closest thing to family she had left, and she would watch him disappear, piece by piece, into the magic of the crown he wore for power but couldn't control. They'd have years together. Good years. Years she'd remember for the rest of her very long existence. And then she'd lose him to something worse than death. Madness that would preserve his body but consume his mind, leaving behind a creature that wore his face but couldn't remember her name. But that was later. Right now, in the frozen ruins, Simon was offering her a can of beans and asking if she was okay, which was the first time anyone had asked her that since the world ended. She wasn't okay, obviously. But she took the beans. Simon had food, actual stores of preserved goods, carefully organised and rationed. He'd been an antiquarian before the war, a collector and researcher of historical artefacts, which meant he knew how to preserve things, how to make resources last. He'd found the crown in the wreckage, put it on because he needed its power to survive, and was slowly discovering that magical artefacts from ancient civilizations come with side effects that aren't immediately obvious. The crown gave him ice powers, cryokinesis on a massive scale. He could freeze threats, create shelter from ice, survive temperatures that would kill normal humans. It made him powerful in a world where power meant survival. But it was also doing something to his mind, changing him. Rewriting his personality, his memories, his fundamental sense of self. The crown wanted a host, and it was slowly transforming Simon into something that could be properly possessed. He didn't tell Marceline that part. Not immediately. He just took care of her. Shared his food, his shelter, his warmth. Sang to her at night when the sounds of the wasteland got too frightening. Made jokes that weren't particularly funny but mattered because they were attempts at normalcy, at pretending the world was still a place where humour existed. He called her kiddo, asked about Hambo, listened to her fragmented stories about her mother, didn't press for details when she couldn't provide them. He treated her like she was worth protecting, which was radical enough in the post-apocalypse, but also like she was worth knowing, worth talking to, worth existing as more than just another survivor. Marceline hadn't realised how much she'd needed that until she had it. They travelled together. Simon had a mission, vague and probably impossible, to find other survivors, to help rebuild, to salvage something from the wreckage. Marceline just wanted to not be alone. They were a strange pair, a middle-aged antiquarian wearing a crown of ice, and a 7-year-old half-demon girl with a stuffed animal. But strange didn't mean much anymore. The world had redefined strange so thoroughly that their partnership barely registered as unusual. Simon taught her things, not survival skills, she was already learning those the hard way, but the things that make survival worth the effort. He taught her songs, old songs from before the war, folk songs and pop songs and silly children's songs that had no purpose except to be joyful. He'd sing while they walked, while they made camp, while they sorted through ruins looking for supplies. His voice wasn't great, but it was human, and in the wasteland of mutation and death, human was precious. He taught her Cheers, the theme song from an old sitcom, something about a bar where everybody knows your name. It was ridiculous, completely disconnected from their reality, a relic of a world where the biggest concern was loneliness in the social sense, rather than the existential sense. But Simon sang it with genuine feeling, like the lyrics mattered, like making your way in the world today did take everything you got, even if the world was now a radioactive hellscape, and everything you got meant canned beans and the will to continue existing. Marceline learned it, learned all his songs. They became her songs, her connection to the man who'd saved her, her evidence that before the apocalypse, humans had made art about connection and community and hope. The songs were proof that humanity had been worth saving, even if most of humanity was gone. Simon was smart about the crown, wore it only when necessary, took it off when he could, tried to limit his exposure to its influence. He knew something was wrong, knew the power came with a cost. He'd have headaches after using it, periods of confusion where he couldn't quite remember who or where he was. Moments of cold that extended beyond the physical into something psychological, something that made him distant and strange. He was fighting it, trying desperately to remain himself, to maintain the identity of Simon Petrikov against the crown's insistence that he become something else. And he was losing. Slowly, incrementally, he was losing the battle. Marceline watched it happen, watched her only friend, her protector, her surrogate father, slowly disappear into madness. The crown's influence grew stronger. Simon's lucid periods grew shorter. He'd forget things, their conversations, plans they'd made, sometimes her name. He'd have episodes where the cold took over, where his eyes went distant and blue and empty, where he'd do things that weren't quite cruel but weren't quite Simon either. And then he'd come back, apologise, promise he'd be more careful, promise he'd take off the crown and never put it on again. And then they'd encounter something dangerous, and he'd need the power to protect them, and he'd put the crown on because what choice did he have? Let them die, or use the magic and lose a little more of himself. He chose the magic, every time. Because keeping Marceline safe mattered more than keeping Simon intact. She didn't understand it then, not fully. She was 7, then 8, then 9. Years passing in the wasteland, seasons marked by varying degrees of terrible. She knew Simon was changing, knew the crown was bad, but she didn't have the cognitive framework to process what she was witnessing. Voluntary self-sacrifice, the destruction of identity in service of protecting someone you love, the tragedy of becoming the monster to fight the monsters. She just knew that sometimes Simon was Simon, and sometimes he was someone else, and the someone else was happening more frequently. He'd still sing to her, even when he couldn't quite remember her name, even when the crown had taken most of his mind, he'd still sing cheers. Like the song was encoded deeper than memory, deeper than personality. In some part of him the crown couldn't fully erase. The melody remained when the man was gone. Marceline would sing along, her voice, clear and strong even as a kid, harmonizing with his deteriorating one. Two survivors in the wasteland singing about a bar where everybody knows your name, pretending they weren't watching him die in the slowest way possible. The promise happened on a particularly bad day. They'd been attacked by mutants. Things that used to be human but weren't anymore, couldn't be called human by any definition that mattered. Simon had used the crown to freeze them, to save them both, but it took more out of him than usual. He was confused afterward, couldn't remember where they were, called Marceline by a name that wasn't hers. But then he had a moment of clarity, looked at her with recognition and horror and love all mixed together. Took her hands in his, which were cold, always cold now, and said the words that would haunt her for the next 1,000 years. "I'm going to keep you safe, kiddo. No matter what happens to me, I'm going to make sure you're okay." He meant it. He kept that promise even as it destroyed him. He used the crown until there was no Simon left to use it. Just the Ice King, a mad creature of winter and loneliness, who couldn't remember the little girl he'd saved but was still somehow, inexplicably, trying to protect everyone he met. Marceline watched Simon Petrikov disappear. Not die, that would have been kinder. She watched him transform into something else, watched the man who'd sung to her and protected her, and made the apocalypse bearable become a stranger wearing his face. The Ice King was born from Simon's sacrifice, from his choice to use the crown one too many times, from his determination to keep Marceline safe no matter the personal cost. He succeeded. She survived. And she'd spend the next millennium knowing that her survival came at the price of his sanity, his identity, his entire self. That Simon Petrikov died so Marceline the Vampire Queen could live. That every song she ever sang was built on the foundation of his absence. She kept the photographs. Simon had a camera, had documented their time together because he knew, even then, that he was losing himself and wanted evidence that he'd existed. Pictures of them in the ruins, making silly faces, trying to smile despite everything. Pictures of Marceline holding Hambo, of Simon wearing the crown, of the two of them surviving together in impossible circumstances. She kept them all, would look at them centuries later and remember when she wasn't alone, when someone had chosen to protect her, when the apocalypse had been terrible but bearable because she had Simon. And she'd remember the day he stopped being Simon. It wasn't dramatic. No final battle, no climactic transformation. Just a gradual slide into madness that ended with him wandering away from their camp, following some impulse the crown implanted, and not coming back. She looked for him, searched for days, weeks, through the ruins and the ice and the growing strangeness of the post-war world. But Simon was gone. The Ice King remained. A mad wizard in the north, building a kingdom of ice, kidnapping princesses, living out some confused fairy tale that the crown constructed from the fragments of Simon's desires and memories. He'd see Marceline sometimes, centuries later, and not recognise her. Would call her Gunther, or Princess, or just get confused and blast ice at her because that's what the Ice King did when confused. But sometimes, very rarely, he'd sing cheers, and Marceline would know that somewhere, buried under magic and madness, Simon was still there, still trying to keep his promise, still protecting her the only way he had left, by not being Simon anymore, so she wouldn't have to watch him suffer. In the frozen wasteland, a little girl sat with her stuffed animal and hummed the theme song from a sitcom about a bar. Behind her, in the distance, the Ice King's crown glowed brighter. In front of her, 1,000 years of loneliness stretched out like a road she'd have to walk forever. The apocalypse had taken her mother. The crown had taken Simon. Marceline learned, young and permanent, that love was something you lost, that the people who protected you disappeared. That survival meant outlasting everyone you cared about and carrying their absence like armour. She was 9 years old and already ancient in the ways that mattered. So she did what survivors do. She kept moving, kept singing Simon's songs, kept holding Hambo, kept being alive because Simon had given up everything to make sure she could be. Sometimes keeping a promise means forgetting you made it. Sometimes love means becoming someone else so the person you love can keep existing. Sometimes the man who saves you disappears so completely that all you have left is a song and the knowledge that somewhere, in a kingdom of ice and madness, he's still trying. Marceline hummed cheers to herself, the melody Simon taught her preserved in her memory better than his face, better than his voice, better than anything except the feeling of being protected by someone who'd chosen her. Making your way in the world today does take everything you got. Simon gave everything. The crown took everything. And Marceline kept going, because that's what you do when someone loves you enough to sacrifice themselves. You keep going. You survive. You turn their absence into music and their memory into purpose, and you float through 1,000 years pretending you're fine. Somewhere in the distance, the Ice King laughed his mad laugh, and Marceline, 9 years old and already carrying centuries of grief, started walking toward a future she'd have to survive alone. Time moves differently when you're immortal and alone. Marceline aged, but not the way humans age. A year would pass, then 5, then 10, and she'd look in a reflective surface and see herself mostly unchanged. Still a kid, then a teenager, then stuck somewhere between adolescence and adulthood where her body decided to just stop counting. Her half-demon constitution meant aging was negotiable, and at some point, maybe 14, maybe 17, the exact year got lost in the blur of survival. Her body looked at the calendar and said, "This is good enough," and stayed there. Forever is a long time to be 17. The decades after Simon disappeared were the hardest. She was old enough to understand what she'd lost, but young enough to not have developed coping mechanisms for loss of that magnitude. So she wandered, through the ruins, through the slowly transforming landscape, through the emerging strangeness that would eventually become ooh. She walked because walking was doing something, and doing something meant not thinking about the man who'd sacrificed himself to keep her safe. The world was rebuilding itself, but not in any way that resembled before. Magic had seeped into reality like water through cracked concrete, filling the spaces where natural law used to be. Mutations weren't just biological anymore, they were metaphysical. Things that shouldn't exist started existing. The Candy Kingdom would eventually rise, a civilization built from animated sweets and scientific principles that bent toward magic. The Ice Kingdom in the north, ruled by a mad wizard who used to be Simon. Kingdoms and principalities and pocket dimensions formed like scabs over the wound of the apocalypse. Marceline saw it happening. Watch Civilization 2.0 bootstrap itself from the wreckage of Civilization 1.0. She didn't participate much, didn't feel like she belonged to this new world any more than she'd belonged to the old one. She was a witness, not a participant, observer of history rather than maker of it. She got good at survival, better than good, exceptional. Her demon nature gave her advantages, but advantages don't mean automatic success. She learned to fight, really fight, using her strength and speed and the inherited chaos of her bloodline. Learned which mushrooms were edible and which would kill you in interesting ways. Learned to read the weather, to track food sources, to identify threats before they became immediate problems. She became competent in the way people become competent when incompetence means death. But competence is lonely. Being good at surviving doesn't mean you have anyone to survive with. She encountered other survivors over the years, scattered pockets of humanity adapting to the new normal, or mutants who'd retained enough consciousness to communicate, or early candy people still figuring out how being alive worked. Some were kind, some were desperate, some were dangerous. None of them stuck around. Partly that was her fault. She'd learned from Simon's disappearance that attachment was pain waiting to happen. Better to keep moving. Better to not get close. Better to be the girl passing through rather than the girl who stays and inevitably loses everyone she cares about. She was friendly but distant, helpful but not available, present but not really there. She perfected the art of being around people without being with them. Partly it was them. Her demon features, subtle but present, marked her as other. The too sharp teeth, the way her eyes sometimes reflected light wrong, the strength that exceeded what her frame suggested. People noticed. People got uncomfortable. In a world where normal was already shattered, Marceline was still too weird, too powerful, too immortal for anyone to relax around. They'd tolerate her presence, trade with her, maybe travel together for a while, but they wouldn't trust her, wouldn't offer the kind of friendship that requires vulnerability. She was fine with that, told herself she was fine with that. Built a whole identity around being fine with that. The cool loner who didn't need anyone, who preferred solitude, who was complete unto herself. It was partly true and partly the biggest lie she ever told. Decades turned into a century. The landscape continued its transformation. Where there had been ruins, now there were forests. Weird forests with candy cane trees and talking birds, but forests nonetheless. Where there had been wastelands, now there were kingdoms establishing territories and trade routes. The world was healing in its strange way, and Marceline was just walking through it, ageless and alone. Then she met the vampires. They found her first, actually. She was maybe 50 years post-Simon, looked 17, was camping in what used to be a city when they surrounded her. 5 of them, apex predators of the New World, creatures who'd either survived from before the war or emerged from it, transformed by magic and mutation into something that fed on life itself. The Vampire King led them. He was ancient even then, powerful in the way that apex predators are powerful. Casually, effortlessly, with the confidence of something that has never encountered a genuine threat. He looked at Marceline with curiosity rather than hunger, which was notable. His court looked at her like dinner. "You smell like demon," the Vampire King said, circling her, "but you bleed like human. What are you, little half-thing?" Marceline was terrified and trying not to show it. She'd fought threats before, survived impossible situations, but these were vampires. Actual vampires. Creatures of power and immortality, who'd already figured out how to thrive in the post-apocalypse while she was still just trying to not die. "I'm Marceline," she said, "because what else do you say when surrounded by predators? And I'm not your dinner." The Vampire King laughed, found her defiance amusing rather than offensive. He could afford to be amused. She wasn't a threat to him, just an interesting anomaly in his territory. He let her go that time, told his court to leave the half-demon alone. She was more useful alive than drained. But the encounter changed something. Marceline had found the thing she was afraid of, the creatures who could actually kill her, who represented a threat her demon constitution couldn't simply shrug off. And instead of running, Instead of avoiding vampire territory forever, she started tracking them. She learned about them, their hierarchy, their powers, their weaknesses. The Vampire King ruled, but beneath him was a court. The Fool, the Empress, the Hierophant, the Moon. Each with their own domain, their own abilities, their own brand of supernatural predation. They fed on humans mostly, the scattered survivors who couldn't defend themselves, draining them of blood and life and leaving empty husks behind. Marceline watched them hunt, saw the casual cruelty, the way they treated other beings as food without consideration or remorse. It was efficient, it was monstrous. It reminded her uncomfortably of her father, the same disregard for other lives, the same assumption that power granted the right to consume. She decided she was going to kill them. Not immediately, she wasn't stupid. But the decision crystallized. These vampires were wrong, were predators that needed removing, and she was the only one who could do it. Her demon nature made her strong enough. Her human heart made her care enough. Together they made her dangerous enough. She spent years preparing, learning to fight properly, not just survive, but actually combat immortal supernatural creatures. She tracked down weapons, artifacts from the pre-war world, or magical items from the new one. She studied vampire lore, figured out their weaknesses, learned which legends were true and which were fiction. She turned herself into a weapon specifically designed to kill the unkillable. The Fool was first. The weakest of the court, all chaos and no strategy. She caught him alone, challenged him, and discovered that vampire essence could be consumed. When she staked him, literally drove a wooden stake through his heart, his power didn't dissipate. It transferred. Flowed into her like liquid night, giving her his abilities, his strength, his immortality stacked on top of her existing semi-immortality. She became part vampire through consumption, through violence, through the act of killing and taking what the killed possessed. It felt wrong and right simultaneously. Wrong because she'd taken a life, absorbed it, become the thing she was fighting. Right because the Fool had been a monster, and now his power was hers to use differently, better, in service of something other than predation. The others fell over the years. The Empress, who controlled minds and saw other beings as toys to manipulate. The Hierophant, who used ideology and righteousness to justify cruelty. The Moon, sophisticated and cruel, who treated hunting as art. Each one's essence became part of Marceline, each one's power added to her growing abilities. She could fly now, turn into a bat, manipulate shadows, move with speed that made her nearly invisible. She was becoming the Vampire Queen by hunting vampires. The irony wasn't lost on her. The Vampire King was last, the oldest, the strongest, the one who'd looked at her decades earlier and seen an amusing half-demon rather than a threat. He didn't see her coming. Didn't realize the girl he'd spared had spent years systematically dismantling his court, absorbing their powers, turning herself into something powerful enough to challenge him. Their fight was brutal. He was ancient and experienced. She was younger, but had the combined powers of his entire court, plus her own demon nature. They destroyed half a forest in the battle, ice and shadow and raw power colliding. When she finally staked him, when she consumed his essence and took his crown, metaphorical and literal, she became the Vampire Queen officially. She was the apex predator now, the most powerful vampire in Ooh. The creature other creatures feared. She'd achieved what she set out to do, removed the predators, made the world safer for the survivors still clinging to existence. And she was completely, utterly alone, because that's what power does. It isolates. She was too strong for anyone to be comfortable around, too dangerous for friendship, too vampiric for trust. She'd saved people from the vampires only to become the thing they now feared. The irony compounded. She'd become the monster to fight the monsters, and now she was stuck being the monster. The blood drinking started as necessity. That's what vampires did. Consume blood, gain sustenance from life force. She tried to do it ethically, only hunting actual threats, only taking from those who deserved it. But ethical vampirism is still vampirism. She was still drinking life, still consuming the essence of other beings, still fundamentally predatory. It disgusted her, reminded her of her father, of the nightosphere, of the inheritance she'd been running from. She was half demon, now mostly vampire, and both halves wanted her to consume life. Her human quarter, the part that was her mother's legacy, screamed in protest. So she stopped. Just decided one day that she wasn't going to drink blood anymore, would drink red instead. The colour, the concept, the abstract quality of redness sucked from objects that possessed it. It was ridiculous. It was impossible. It worked because magic in ooh is negotiable, and literalism is optional. She became a freak among vampires, a vampire queen who didn't drink blood. It should have weakened her, should have stripped her powers, but demon nature plus vampire essence plus sheer stubborn determination kept her functionally immortal and powerful. She'd found a loophole in supernatural biology through sheer force of will. That decision mattered more than any battle she won. That choice, to reject the predatory nature that both halves of her inheritance demanded, defined who Marceline was. Not demon, not vampire, but someone who carried darkness and chose light anyway. Someone who had the power to consume and chose abstinence. Someone who was technically a monster, but refused to be monstrous. The centuries accumulated. She watched kingdoms rise. The Candy Kingdom coalesced from scattered candy people into an actual civilization, led by a pink princess who was building something beautiful and functional from literal sweetness. Marceline watched from a distance, curious but not involved. She'd learned that involvement meant attachment meant loss. But the pink princess was persistent. Princess Bubblegum, Bonnibel, though Marceline wouldn't learn that name for a while, was unlike anyone Marceline had met. She was immortal too, or functionally immortal, sustained by the same candy she'd created herself from. She was brilliant, scientific, rational in ways that shouldn't work in magical ooh, but somehow did. She looked at the vampire queen floating outside her kingdom and saw not a threat but a potential ally. Or maybe just saw loneliness recognizing loneliness. They became friends, then more than friends. Then something complicated that neither of them had vocabulary for because immortal relationships don't follow normal trajectories. They had centuries to explore what they were to each other, which meant they also had centuries to hurt each other, misunderstand each other, break each other's hearts in ways that accumulated like compound interest. Bubblegum wanted to fix things. Marceline wanted to feel things. Bubblegum needed control. Marceline needed chaos. They were opposites in most ways and similar in the ways that mattered. Both immortal, both powerful, both fundamentally lonely. Both trying to build meaning in a world that had forgotten how meaning worked. They were together for decades, maybe a century. Time blurred when you were happy, and Marceline was happy in ways she'd forgotten were possible. Bubblegum made her laugh, made her feel seen, made her feel like maybe immortality wasn't just accumulated loss, maybe it could be shared experience. Maybe love could work when both people had forever. Then it ended. Spectacularly. Painfully. In ways that neither of them processed properly because immortals are terrible at emotional resolution. They hurt each other and broke apart and spent the next several centuries pretending they were fine while obviously not being fine. Marceline moved frequently after that. Never settled anywhere for long. She'd claim territories. This mountain is mine, this forest, this cave, but wouldn't make homes. Home was where you got hurt. Better to have bases than homes, temporary shelters than permanent residences. She was the vampire queen of nowhere in particular, floating through ooh like a ghost of herself. She collected things. Artifacts from the pre-war world mostly. Pieces of before that she couldn't let go of even though before was long dead. Furniture, posters, photographs. Evidence that humanity had existed and created and mattered. Her houses became museums of absence, shrines to the world she'd survived outlasting. The bass guitar became her constant companion. Music was the only thing that didn't betray her, the only relationship that didn't end in loss. She wrote songs about everything she couldn't say. Grief, loneliness, anger, love, the specific quality of heartbreak when your ex-girlfriend is immortal, so you have to keep existing in proximity to her forever. The songs were honest when she couldn't be, vulnerable when she'd learned to be defended, human when she was technically neither human nor vampire nor demon, but all three in unfortunate combination. Centuries. Plural. Multiple hundreds of years of existing without truly living, surviving without purpose beyond survival itself, accumulating memories like scar tissue. She watched generations of candy people live and die in what felt like fast forward. Watched Princess Bubblegum build her kingdom, maintain it, defend it, become the competent ruler Marceline had always known she'd be. Watched from a distance because distance was safe. She was the oldest person in U by the time Finn and Jake showed up, had lived through everything, seen everything, survived everything, was so thoroughly defended that she'd forgotten what being open felt like, was so convinced that loneliness was her permanent state that she'd stopped fighting it. The Vampire Queen, technically. The girl with a stuffed animal, actually. The survivor who'd outlived her own survival instincts. The immortal who couldn't remember why immortality had seemed like a gift. She floated in her house and played her bass and told herself she was fine. Told herself the centuries of isolation were a choice, not a wound. Told herself she didn't need connection, didn't need friendship, didn't need love. She was complete, self-sufficient, perfectly functional in her dysfunction. The loneliness was just how things were. The ache was just background noise. The feeling that she'd somehow failed at immortality, that existing this long without finding meaning was its own tragedy, that was just truth. Unavoidable truth. She'd survived the apocalypse, Simon's madness, the vampire court, heartbreak, and centuries of wandering. She'd become powerful and isolated in equal measure. She'd learned every lesson except the one that mattered. That survival isn't the same as living, that immortality without connection is just elaborate dying. But she had her base, she had her songs, she had the ability to suck the red out of strawberries and pretend that was sufficient substitute for actual sustenance, actual life, actual meaning. The Vampire Queen floated in her cave full of artifacts from a dead world, playing music for an audience of none, existing because existing was what she did. Forever and ever, unchanged and unchanging, the girl who survived everything except loneliness. At least she had the songs, Simon's songs, her songs, the songs that made eternity slightly more bearable. Making your way in the world today still took everything you got. After several centuries, Marceline was running low on everything, but she kept going anyway because that's what survivors do. They survive, even when survival is its own kind of slow dying. There are worse things than death, and Marceline knew all of them intimately because she watched them happen to Simon Petrikov across 1,000 years. Death is clean, final. You lose someone and they're gone, and grief has a shape you can hold, a narrative you can process. Simon didn't die. Simon transformed, slowly and incompletely, into something that wore his body but couldn't access his memories. The Ice King was born from Simon's sacrifice, and Marceline had to watch the birth happen in slow motion over decades, then watch the result wander for centuries afterward. A mad wizard who sometimes, in fragments, remembered there was someone he'd promised to protect. She kept tabs on him, had to. The Ice King established his kingdom in the north, built a castle from ice and loneliness, and Marceline knew exactly where it was at all times. She'd fly over occasionally, watch from a distance, make sure he was okay in the limited way that someone completely insane can be okay. He was surviving. Building ice sculptures, kidnapping princesses, living out some corrupted fairy tale the crown had constructed from the ruins of his actual memories. He didn't recognize her. Not really. Not in any way that mattered. The first time she approached him directly, maybe a century after he'd wandered away from their camp, she thought maybe enough time had passed that the crown's hold had stabilized. That Simon might still be in there, accessible, waiting. She landed in front of his ice castle and called out his name. "Simon, it's me, Marceline, from before, remember?" The Ice King emerged from his castle, looked at her with those empty blue eyes and said, "I don't know any Simon. I'm the Ice King and you're trespassing in my kingdom. Are you a princess? You look like you might be a princess." She tried to remind him. Talked about the apocalypse, about canned beans and songs they'd sung together, about the promise he'd made to keep her safe. He listened with the confused attention of someone hearing a story about a stranger, occasionally interjecting with completely unrelated observations about penguins or his latest ice sculpture, or whether she wanted to marry him. She left, came back years later and tried again, and again, and again. each time hoping that something would click, that the right word or memory would unlock whatever was left of Simon. Each time encountering the same confused wizard who knew there was something he should remember, but couldn't quite access it. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. She loved Simon, genuinely, deeply, in the way you love someone who saved your life and made the apocalypse bearable. But Simon was gone. The Ice King remained, a being who shared Simon's body but not his mind, his memories, his essential Simonness. How do you grieve someone who's still alive? How do you love a memory while hating what replaced it? She couldn't hate the Ice King. That was the problem. He was annoying, sure. Kidnapped princesses constantly, which was objectively terrible. Obsessed over companionship in ways that were creepy and sad in equal measure. But he wasn't evil. Wasn't cruel. Was just deeply, catastrophically lonely, acting out scripts the Crown had written, trying to fill a void he didn't understand with princesses and ice sculptures and the vague sense that something was missing. He was still Simon's kindness, scrambled and corrupted. Still the man who'd sung to a scared child, just unable to remember the child or the songs or why singing mattered. The Ice King's princess obsession wasn't random. It was his damaged brain's interpretation of protecting someone, of keeping someone safe, of fulfilling a promise he couldn't consciously recall making. Every princess he kidnapped was Marceline. Not literally, but symbolically. The Crown had taken Simon's core drive, protect the girl, keep her safe, and twisted it into this bizarre courtship ritual. He was still trying to keep his promise. He just couldn't remember who he'd promised, or why it mattered, or that the person he was trying to save was the 1,000-year-old vampire watching from outside his castle. Marceline understood this eventually. It took her centuries, but she figured it out. The Ice King wasn't Simon's death. He was Simon's afterlife. The ghost of who he'd been, haunting his own body, trying to accomplish something he couldn't articulate. And that understanding made it worse, not better, because it meant Simon was still in there somewhere, still trying, still failing. She kept her distance mostly, would interact when necessary, when their paths crossed in Yu's weird social network, would tolerate his presence at parties, his attempts at conversation, his complete failure to recognize her as anything other than that vampire girl who's mean to me. She was mean to him. Not cruel, but sharp, defensive. Because being soft with the Ice King meant acknowledging the Simon-shaped hole, and that hole was too painful to directly examine. Then Finn and Jake found the tapes. Holly Jolly Secrets. The episode where everything Marceline had been avoiding became unavoidable. The videotapes Simon had recorded before he completely lost himself. Messages to the future. Confessions about the Crown and what it was doing to him. Finn and Jake brought them to her, asked if she knew the man in the videos, and she had to watch Simon explain his own disintegration. I'm trying to record this as a reminder to myself. The Crown is affecting me. I think I'm losing my mind. But I can't take it off. I need its power to survive in this world. I need it to protect her. Her, Marceline. The little girl he'd saved who'd become the Vampire Queen, who'd survived 1,000 years because Simon Petrikov had chosen to lose himself. She watched all the tapes. Watched Simon deteriorate across recordings, his lucidity decreasing, his awareness fragmenting, the Crown taking more with each video until the final tape was just confused, rambling about princesses and ice and loneliness. Watched the exact moment Simon stopped being Simon and became something else. And then she had to go back to seeing the Ice King at parties and pretending she was fine. The confrontation happened because Jake said something stupid. Not maliciously stupid, just casually stupid in the way Jake sometimes was. Mentioned to the Ice King that Marceline had tapes of him from before he was the Ice King, and wouldn't it be interesting to see them? The Ice King showed up at her house, demanded to see the tapes, was insistent in his annoying way, the way he got about things his damaged brain fixated on. Marceline refused initially, told him to leave, tried to protect him from his own history, but he wouldn't go. Kept asking, kept pushing, and finally she gave in because what was the point of protecting him from knowledge he couldn't retain anyway? They watched the tapes together, Simon explaining who he used to be, what the Crown was doing, his desperate attempts to leave messages for his future self. The Ice King watched with growing confusion, occasional recognition flickering across his face. That's me? I used to be different? I used to have brown hair? He couldn't hold it. The memories wouldn't stick. Whatever the crown had done to his brain, it prevented integration of pre-Ice King information. He'd understand for a moment, feel the weight of who he'd been, and then it would slip away like water through fingers. By the end of the tapes, he was asking questions he'd already asked, confused by answers he'd already heard. Marceline watched him fail to remember over and over, watched the tragedy loop because his brain couldn't complete the circuit, watched him experience grief about losing himself without being able to maintain that grief long enough to process it. I Remember You happened a while later, the episode that broke everyone who watched it, the convergence of Marceline's grief and the Ice King's oblivious presence in the same physical space. He showed up at her house with letters, old letters, yellowed paper covered in handwriting that was trying to remain steady while the mind guiding it collapsed. Letters Simon had written to her, or to himself, or to no one. Messages from a dying consciousness, scattered thoughts about survival and fear and promises he was trying to keep. I found these in my castle, and I thought they might make good song lyrics, the Ice King said, completely missing that the letters were his own disintegrating thoughts. Maybe we could write a song together? Marceline looked at the letters, saw Simon's handwriting fragmenting across pages, saw his desperation preserved in fading ink, saw evidence of his mental collapse carefully preserved by an Ice King who didn't understand what he'd preserved. She wanted to scream, wanted to cry, wanted to shake him until Simon fell out of the Ice King's shell and came back. Instead, she said, "Yeah, we can write a song." They sat together, the Ice King completely oblivious, Marceline barely holding herself together. He read the letters out loud, found them interesting in an abstract way, didn't recognise them as his own thoughts. Marceline listened to Simon's words spoken in the Ice King's voice and felt something break that she'd been carefully maintaining for centuries. "This part's good," the Ice King said, pointing at a letter. "Where are you? I'm so scared. That's like deep. Good for a song." It was Simon's plea, his literal cry for help from the past, preserved and delivered by his own future self who couldn't understand what he was delivering. She played the bass, put Simon's dying thoughts to music while the Ice King hummed along, pleased with their collaboration. The song they created was Simon's tragedy translated through Marceline's grief, performed by the Ice King's oblivious presence. It was the cruelest duet in existence. Near the end, the Ice King had a moment, just a flicker of recognition, of Simon surfacing briefly. He looked at Marceline with sudden clarity and said, "Marceline, is that you? I'm sorry if I've been weird lately. I've been having these episodes where I..." And then he was gone. Back to the Ice King, confused about why they were sitting together, asking if they were dating now, oblivious again. Marceline wanted to hold on to him, keep him in that moment of recognition, force him to stay Simon long enough to have an actual conversation. But you can't hold water. You can't force memory into a brain that won't retain it. Simon was gone, and the Ice King was what remained, and no amount of desperate wanting would change that. She finished the song, let him go, watched him leave her house, pleased with their musical collaboration, already forgetting what they'd created or why it mattered. He waddled off toward his Ice Kingdom, humming tunelessly, carrying letters he didn't understand were his own suicide note written in slow motion. The weight of it was unbearable. Simon had given up everything to keep her safe, had used the crown until there was no Simon left. Just this confused wizard who still carried the core of Simon's kindness, but couldn't access Simon's memory or identity or understanding of who he'd sacrificed himself for. And Marceline had to watch him wander, alone and mad, trying to fill the void where his identity used to be with princesses and ice sculptures, and the vague sense that something important was missing. What do you owe someone who saved your life but doesn't remember saving it? Everything and nothing. You owe them your survival. She was alive because Simon chose the crown. But you can't repay the debt to Simon because Simon doesn't exist anymore. The Ice King is what's left, and he doesn't know he's owed anything. He just knows he's lonely and confused and looking for something he can't name. Marceline tried to be kind to him after that. Still couldn't be close. The pain was too sharp. But she stopped being as harsh, tolerated his presence better. Let him ramble about his princess obsession without mockery. It wasn't his fault. The Ice King was doing his best with a broken brain and a mission he couldn't remember. He was still trying to keep his promise, in his way. still trying to protect everyone he met, even if his method was kidnapping and his reasoning was scrambled nonsense. She visited sometimes, just showed up at his ice castle, played her bass, let him ramble. He'd tell her about his day, about the princesses who'd rejected him, about his latest ice sculpture that looked like abstract loneliness. She'd listen. Not because the Ice King was interesting, he mostly wasn't, but because Simon had been interesting, and this was the closest she'd get to Simon now. Sometimes, very rarely, he'd sing Cheers, just randomly start humming it, or sing a few bars, or get confused because he knew the song but couldn't remember learning it. Those moments destroyed her every time. The song was encoded too deep for the crown to fully erase, buried in whatever part of the brain survives complete mental collapse. Simon's gift to young Marceline, preserved in the Ice King's subconscious, surfacing occasionally like messages from the dead. She'd sing along, harmonise with his broken humming, make it a duet across the gap between who he was and who he'd become. Music as the only language that transcended the crown's damage. The only way to have a conversation with someone who couldn't maintain conversation. Making your way in the world today really did take everything you got. Simon gave everything. Everything he was. Everything he could have been. His entire self-sacrifice so a little girl could survive the apocalypse. And the result was this. A mad wizard who couldn't remember the sacrifice but was still somehow enacting it. Still trying to save everyone. Still keeping a promise he couldn't articulate. The Ice King would never understand what he'd done for her. Would never recover enough to hear her say thank you, or I love you, or your sacrifice mattered. He'd just keep kidnapping princesses and building ice sculptures and being confused about why he felt so empty. Simon's afterlife was ice and madness and partial memories that surfaced and dissolved like snow. Marceline carried the weight for both of them, remembered Simon so he didn't have to, kept his tapes, his letters, his photographs, preserved the man he'd been in her memory since his brain couldn't preserve it. She was Simon's history, his context, his proof that he'd existed as more than the Ice King. When the crown finally released him, if it ever released him, she'd be there to tell him who he'd been. Until then, she floated in her house and played the songs he'd taught her. Cheers, especially. The stupid theme song from a show about a bar where everybody knows your name, sung by a man losing his mind to an ancient crown, taught to a girl who'd remember it for 1,000 years. It was the saddest song in Ooh, not because of its content, but because of its context. The Ice King would forget their duet, forget the letters, the tapes, the moments of clarity where Simon almost surfaced. Forget everything by tomorrow, or next week, or the next time the crown decided memories were optional. But Marceline would remember, would carry every moment, every almost recognition, every time he'd looked at her with Simon's eyes before sliding back into the Ice King's madness. This was love in the apocalypse's aftermath. Not death and mourning, but endless partial loss. Not closure, but an open wound that never healed because the person you were grieving kept showing up at parties. The cruelest love story wasn't Romeo and Juliet or any human tragedy with an ending. It was a man becoming a monster to save a girl, and the girl having to watch the monster wear his face for eternity. Marceline would survive it. She survived everything. But surviving isn't the same as being okay, and she was very much not okay about Simon. Would never be okay about Simon. Would carry his sacrifice like armour, and his absence like an open wound until the end of time, or the crown finally broke, whichever came first. The Ice King hummed Cheers in his castle. Marceline hummed it in hers. Two survivors of the apocalypse, separated by madness and centuries, connected by a song about wanting to go where everybody knows your name. Sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name. Sometimes the person who knew your name forgets it completely. Sometimes love means watching someone disappear in slow motion and not being able to stop it. Sometimes the person you loved most becomes the saddest thing in your entire immortal existence, and you just have to keep existing anyway. The Ice King built another ice sculpture. Marceline played another song. Simon was gone. The promise remained. And somewhere between past and present, tragedy looped endlessly because that's what immortality does to grief, makes it permanent. Princess Bubblegum was building a kingdom from literal candy when Marceline first saw her, and honestly, That should have been the warning sign right there. Who looks at a post-apocalyptic wasteland and thinks, you know what this needs? Sentient gumdrops. Someone brilliant, someone ambitious, someone who'd looked at the end of the world and decided endings were negotiable. Someone Marceline would absolutely catastrophically fall for. It was early in the Candy Kingdom's formation, maybe a century, maybe two after the Mushroom War. Marceline was wandering, doing her Vampire Queen thing, when she noticed something weird. Well, weirder than usual. A settlement that glowed pink at night, populated by beings made of sugar and scientific principles that shouldn't work but did. At the centre of it all was a princess who looked like she was maybe 20 but carried herself with the weariness of someone much older. Bonabelle Bubblegum. Though it would be years before Marceline learned her actual name, learned that the princess wasn't just a title, but a person underneath all that pink perfection. Their first meeting wasn't romantic, wasn't even particularly friendly. Marceline floated into Candy Kingdom territory because she didn't respect borders, and Bubblegum confronted her because she took borders very seriously. Two immortals circling each other, trying to figure out if the other was threat or opportunity. "You're trespassing," Bubblegum said, standing in front of her half-built candy castle with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "You're building a civilization out of desserts," Marceline replied. "I don't think you get to lecture me about questionable choices." Bubblegum's eyes narrowed. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. "Fair point. Would you like to see how it works? The candy animation process is actually fascinating. I'm using a combination of bioengineering and what appears to be localized magic fields to create sustainable life from simple sugars." Marceline had no idea what half those words meant, but she was intrigued despite herself. This pink princess wasn't afraid of her, wasn't trying to attack or flee, was just offering to explain science. In the apocalypse, that was new. She stayed, just for a bit, just to see what this whole Candy Kingdom thing was about. Bubblegum explained her process with genuine enthusiasm, showed her the laboratory where she was experimenting with different confectionery life forms, talked about her plans to build a stable society in the ruins of civilization. She was passionate in a way Marceline hadn't seen in centuries, passionate about creation, about building, about making something beautiful from the ashes. It was attractive, dangerously so. They kept running into each other after that. Marceline would pass through Candy Kingdom territory, Bubblegum would invite her to see the latest development. They'd talk about science, about the world before, about the strange magic-science hybrid that Ooh was becoming. Bubblegum treated her like an equal, which was rare. Most people treated Marceline like a threat or a curiosity. Bubblegum just treated her like someone interesting to talk to. Somewhere in those conversations, friendship happened. And somewhere in that friendship, something deeper started growing that neither of them had vocabulary for because immortal queer relationships in post-apocalyptic Candy Kingdoms aren't exactly covered in conventional relationship guides. Bubblegum was brilliant. That was the first thing you noticed. Her mind worked faster than most people could follow, connecting concepts and solving problems with the kind of intellectual horsepower that would have won Nobel Prizes if Nobel Prizes still existed. She was building an entire civilization from scratch, creating new forms of life, establishing governance and infrastructure and culture. She was doing what humanity had failed to do, survive with intentionality rather than just survival. But she was also lonely. That was the thing Marceline noticed second. All that brilliance, all that creation, and Bubblegum was fundamentally alone in it. Her candy people were alive, sure, but they weren't equals. They were her children in a way, her responsibility. You can't confide in someone you created, can't be vulnerable with someone who exists because you willed them into being. Marceline understood loneliness, had lived in it for centuries, seeing it reflected in someone else, someone who was trying so hard to not be lonely by surrounding herself with an entire kingdom of sweet subjects. That resonated. They fell together gradually. No dramatic declaration, no obvious beginning, just increasing proximity, increasing vulnerability, increasing willingness to be themselves around each other. Bubblegum would show Marceline her failures, the experiments that didn't work, the candy people who didn't animate properly. Marceline would play songs that weren't performed for anyone, the honest ones, the ones that exposed exactly how not fine she was. They understood each other in ways that mattered, both immortal both powerful, both fundamentally isolated by their nature. Both trying to figure out what you do with forever when forever stretches out empty and infinite. Both smart enough to see the tragedy of their situation and stubborn enough to try anyway. The relationship, because it was definitely a relationship, even if neither of them called it that initially, was intense. When you're immortal and you finally find someone who might actually stick around, you invest everything. They were together constantly. Marceline would float around Bubblegum's lab while she worked, offering commentary and distraction. Bubblegum would attend Marceline's impromptu concerts, the only audience member who actually understood the subtext in the lyrics. They were happy, genuinely, surprisingly happy. For decades, maybe a century, they figured out what it meant to be together when together could mean forever. They learned each other's rhythms, their boundaries, their needs. Bubblegum needed order and control. Marceline needed chaos and freedom. They negotiated the space between those needs, found compromise, built something that worked, until it didn't. The problem was fundamental. They were too similar in the ways that made them incompatible. Both stubborn, both convinced their approach to existence was correct, both unwilling to compromise on the things that mattered most. Bubblegum needed to fix things, to optimize them, to make them better through application of logic and control. Marceline needed to feel things, to let them be messy, to accept that some problems don't have solutions. Bubblegum looked at Marceline's trauma and wanted to engineer a solution. Marceline looked at Bubblegum's control issues and wanted her to just feel her feelings without trying to rationalize them. Neither approach worked for the other person. The fight started small. Disagreements about Candy Kingdom policy, about how Bubblegum interacted with her subjects, about Marceline's tendency to disappear for weeks without warning. They'd argue, make up, pretend everything was fine. But the fundamental tension remained. Bubblegum needed certainty, and Marceline needed freedom, and those needs were eventually incompatible. The shirt was the beginning of the end, though neither of them knew it at the time. Marceline's old shirt, the one Bubblegum had borrowed and kept. It smelled like Marceline, carried her essence, became a comfort object for Princess Bubblegum in ways she'd never articulated. When Marceline asked for it back, Bubblegum said no, just a flat refusal, no explanation that made sense. Because how do you explain that you're keeping your girlfriend's shirt because you're terrified she's going to leave and the shirt is the only piece of her you can control? That you're so scared of abandonment that you're holding hostage a piece of clothing? That love for you looks like possession because you've never learned any other way to hold on to things? Marceline didn't understand. Felt like Bubblegum was being controlling over something trivial, like this was another example of PB needing to manage everything, including Marceline's wardrobe. The shirt became symbolic of Bubblegum's need to control, of Marceline's need for autonomy, of the ways they fundamentally couldn't meet each other's emotional needs. They broke up, not cleanly, not with closure, just a gradual drifting apart that became permanent. Marceline stopped coming around. Bubblegum stopped inviting her. They went from together to separate without ever having the actual breakup conversation, without processing what went wrong, without acknowledging that they'd just ended something that had mattered more than either was willing to admit. And then they spent 800 years not dealing with it. 800 years. That's the thing about immortal breakups. You can avoid your ex for literal centuries and it barely counts as meaningful distance. They existed in the same world, ran in the same circles, had mutual friends. They just didn't talk, didn't acknowledge what they'd been to each other, built walls and pretended those walls were casual indifference rather than active protection. Marceline wrote songs about it. Angry songs, hurt songs, songs that were obviously about Bubblegum to anyone paying attention. I'm Just Your Problem was maybe the least subtle thing she'd ever created. A musical middle finger wrapped in melody, expressing every ounce of hurt and rage and unprocessed grief about their relationship's end. She performed it at Bubblegum, just walked up to her at a group gathering and sang directly at her, making eye contact, ensuring every word landed with maximum impact. It was aggressive and vulnerable simultaneously, a public emotional evisceration disguised as a casual jam session. I'm Gonna Drink the Red from Your Pretty Pink Face wasn't about vampirism. Well, it was also about vampirism. But mostly it was about wanting to consume what Bubblegum had, To take the control and composure and careful pink perfection and just destroy it. Because if Marceline was going to feel this terrible, Bubblegum should too. Bubblegum sat through it, didn't respond, just took the musical assault with her characteristic composure, maintaining that infuriating calm that Marceline could never crack. Which made it worse, obviously. Because Marceline wanted a reaction, wanted acknowledgement, wanted Bubblegum to feel something rather than just analyse and compartmentalise and remain perfectly composed. They were terrible at being exes, terrible at being in proximity. Every interaction was charged with 800 years of unprocessed feelings, every conversation a minefield of subtext and careful avoidance. They hurt each other casually, constantly, through sheer inability to just talk about what had happened. But they also couldn't fully let go. That was the other thing. They were still drawn to each other, still protective of each other, still fundamentally connected in ways that transcended their relationship's end. When Marceline needed something, Bubblegum would still help. When Bubblegum faced threats, Marceline would still show up. The Hambo incident proved that. Marceline had lost Hambo, traded it away in a moment of desperation, lost the one physical connection to her mother and Simon and before. She was devastated in ways she couldn't articulate, couldn't ask for help with, because asking for help meant being vulnerable, and vulnerability was what got you hurt. Bubblegum noticed. Despite centuries of not talking, despite the walls between them, she noticed Marceline's distress, and she did what she always did. She fixed it. Travelled to Maya the Sky Witch, negotiated a deal, retrieved Hambo through combination of scientific understanding and sheer determination. She gave it back to Marceline without fanfare, just handed over the stuffed animal like it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. It was everything. It was Bubblegum saying, "I know what matters to you and I'll move dimensions to get it back," without actually saying any of that. It was love expressed through action instead of words, which was the most Bubblegum way possible to express anything. Marceline cried, held Hambo and cried, and Bubblegum saw her cry, saw her vulnerable and broken, and didn't try to fix that. Just stood there and let Marceline feel it. For once, PB didn't try to engineer a solution to emotions, just witnessed them. That was the beginning of healing. Not immediate, not dramatic, but the crack in the wall that let them start seeing each other again. Varmints was when they actually talked. Properly talked. For the first time in centuries. Bubblegum called Marceline to help with a pest problem in the Candy Kingdom, which was transparent pretext for wanting to spend time together. They hunted varmints and talked about control, about fear, about the ways Bubblegum needed to manage everything because management was the only thing keeping chaos at bay. "I care about everyone and everything in the Candy Kingdom," Bubblegum admitted. "Sometimes I feel like I'm going to drown in it." Marceline understood. She'd been drowning in her own feelings for centuries. Different execution, same fundamental problem. Too much existence, too little capacity to process it all. They were both overwhelmed by immortality, just expressing it differently. They started rebuilding, slowly, carefully, with the caution of people who'd been hurt badly enough to know they could be hurt again. Friendship first. Relearning how to be around each other without the weight of their past relationship crushing every interaction. They played video games, hung out casually, started remembering why they'd liked each other originally. The Stakes miniseries tested everything. Marceline wanted to become mortal, to give up her vampire powers and finally die eventually. It was driven by fear. Fear that she'd become like the vampires she'd killed. Fear that immortality was corrupting her. Fear that she was fundamentally monstrous. Bubblegum was terrified. Couldn't articulate why at first, but the terror was palpable. Because Bubblegum had already lost Marceline once to their breakup. The thought of losing her permanently to mortality and death was unbearable. She'd built walls to survive the breakup, but those walls couldn't protect against actual loss. She wanted Marceline alive more than she wanted to be right, more than she wanted control, more than anything. When the vampires returned, all the ones Marceline had killed, resurrected and hunting her, Bubblegum went full protective mode, built weapons, strategized, fought alongside Marceline with the desperate intensity of someone trying to prevent the inevitable. She was facing the thing she feared most, that everyone she loved would eventually leave, and she'd be alone in her Candy Kingdom with her creations, managing eternity by herself. Marceline saw it. saw Bubblegum's fear, saw the love underneath the control issues, saw that PB's need to manage everything was just terror in scientific clothing, and she chose to become a vampire again. Not because she wanted the powers, but because Bubblegum needed her to stay, and staying meant accepting her nature, her immortality, her place as the Vampire Queen. They grew closer after that. Finally started addressing the 800-year-old elephant in the room, finally started talking about what they'd been to each other and what they might be again. It was tentative, careful, both of them scared of repeating past mistakes. But they were trying. The finale was when they stopped being careful. Golb attacked, reality was collapsing, and suddenly the question wasn't, should we get back together, but why are we wasting time pretending we're not in love? They fought side by side, protected each other, and when the dust settled, they kissed, just kissed, in front of everyone. A declaration that they were together, that they'd figured out their stuff, that after centuries of hurting each other, they'd chosen to try again. The kiss mattered beyond just their relationship. Adventure Time had been dancing around Bublin for years, subtext and implications and moments that were obvious to anyone paying attention, but never explicitly confirmed. The finale kiss was confirmation, canon. Two women who loved each other, who'd had a relationship and broken up and found each other again, who were choosing each other in front of the entire land of Ooh. For a generation that grew up with Adventure Time, that representation mattered. Queer love wasn't a joke or subtext or something to be ashamed of. It was Marceline and Bubblegum, two of the show's most important characters, being together, being happy. Getting a happy ending that acknowledged their queerness as fundamental to who they were. Obsidian, the Distant Land special, showed them actually together. In a relationship, working through their issues like adults, facing Marceline's past literally in the form of a dragon she'd made a deal with centuries ago. They fought. They made up. They chose each other again. Their relationship wasn't perfect. They still had their fundamental differences, their friction points, but they'd learned how to navigate those differences without breaking. Bubblegum learned to let go of control sometimes. Marceline learned to be vulnerable without immediately fleeing. They both learned that love doesn't require perfection, just commitment to working through imperfection together. The pink and the grey, science and chaos, control and freedom. Two immortals who'd spent centuries hurting each other, finally figuring out that hurting each other less was an option. That love could work when both people had forever, if they chose to spend that forever together instead of apart. Marceline floated in Bubblegum's lab sometimes just to be near her. Bubblegum would leave her experiments to watch Marceline play bass. They'd learned each other again, differently this time, with the wisdom of centuries and the honesty of people who'd already lost each other once and refused to do it again. They were still themselves. Bubblegum still needed order. Marceline still needed chaos. But they'd found the space where those needs could coexist, where compromise didn't feel like surrender, where love was big enough to hold their contradictions. 800 years of avoiding each other, then choosing to stop avoiding. That was the story. That was Bubbline. Two complicated immortals figuring out that complicated doesn't mean impossible, that love is work, but work can be worth it, that sometimes the person who drives you crazy is also the person you can't imagine existing without. The Vampire Queen and the Candy Princess. Grey and pink, chaos and control. Together, after everything, despite everything, because of everything. Sometimes love looks like getting your ex's shirt back. Sometimes it looks like retrieving a stuffed animal from a witch. Sometimes it looks like choosing to be immortal so you can keep existing alongside someone who needs you to stay. Sometimes love is just two people who've hurt each other deciding to stop hurting each other. To try again, to spend forever figuring out what forever means together. Marceline had spent centuries alone. Now she wasn't. That was revolutionary. Princess Bubblegum had built a kingdom but couldn't build connection. Now she could. That was healing. Together they were still complicated, still difficult, still themselves. But themselves together was better than themselves apart, and after 800 years they'd finally learned that truth. The bass guitar played softer now. The lab stayed warmer. Two immortals in love figuring it out, one day at a time, forever. Marceline decided she wanted to die, which was probably the most alive decision she'd made in centuries. Not immediately, not dramatically, just eventually. She wanted mortality back, wanted the option of an ending, wanted to not be the Vampire Queen anymore because being the Vampire Queen meant being a vampire, and being a vampire meant carrying darkness she'd spent 1,000 years trying to reject. She'd stopped drinking blood, sure, but the capacity for it remained, the hunger, suppressed but present. The nature she'd inherited through violence when she killed the vampire court and consumed their essences. She was tired of carrying power she didn't want, tired of immortality that felt more like a sentence than a gift, tired of being the thing she'd hunted, the creature she'd become to fight creatures. She wanted out. Princess Bubblegum could maybe make it happen. Science plus magic equals negotiable reality, and and if anyone could engineer a solution to vampirism, it was PB. So Marceline asked, just floated into the Candy Kingdom one day and said, I want you to make me mortal. I want to stop being a vampire. Can you do it? Bubblegum's response was immediate and visceral. No, absolutely not. That's dangerous and irreversible, and you could die. Which was the point, actually, but PB wasn't ready to hear that. They argued. Bubblegum threw science at the problem, explaining the risks, the complications, the ways removing Marceline's vampirism could go catastrophically wrong. Marceline threw emotions at it, explaining how carrying this darkness for centuries was exhausting, how she wanted to be something other than the Vampire Queen, how choosing mortality was choosing humanity over monstrosity. Eventually Bubblegum agreed, not because she thought it was a good idea, but because saying no meant losing Marceline to resentment, and she'd already lost her once. She'd try. She'd use every resource at her disposal to extract the vampirism safely, to give Marceline the mortality she wanted. The process was complicated, required Bubblegum to literally extract the vampire essence from Marceline's body, pulling out the power she had absorbed from 5 vampires over centuries. It was medical and magical simultaneously, science fiction meeting fantasy in ways that only worked in Marceline lay on a table while Bubblegum worked, and for the first time in 1,000 years she felt vulnerable. Actually vulnerable, not just emotionally but physically. Mortal. It worked. The vampire essence separated, contained in a tube of glowing red energy. Marceline sat up, tested her body, felt the absence where power used to be. She couldn't fly anymore, couldn't turn into a bat or manipulate shadows, couldn't do any of the vampire things that had defined her for centuries. She was just Marceline now, half demon, sure, but no longer queen of anything. She felt lighter. The weight of vampirism, the burden she'd carried since killing the vampire court, was gone. She could die eventually, could age, maybe, or at least not be frozen in eternal 17, could be something other than the creature she'd become through violence. The relief lasted approximately 3 hours. The vampire essence wasn't stable, couldn't be contained properly because vampire power doesn't like being separated from its host. The tube cracked, the essence escaped. And worse, it found the bodies of the vampires Marceline had killed centuries ago. The Fool, the Empress, the Hierophant, the Moon, the Vampire King, dead and buried and theoretically gone forever, but in dead is negotiable when magic gets involved. They came back, all 5 vampires resurrected by the essence Marceline had taken from them, now freed and looking for revenge. The past literally returning to feed. Finn and Jake responded with their typical enthusiasm, monsters to fight, adventure to have, clear villains to defeat. They didn't fully understand what they were facing. These weren't regular monsters. These were apex predators from the post-apocalypse, creatures who'd survived the Mushroom War and thrived afterward, who'd been powerful enough that it took Marceline decades to hunt them all down the first time, and Marceline was mortal now, vulnerable, unable to fight them the way she'd fought them before. She'd given up the power that made her their equal, and now they were back, and she was just a half-demon girl who couldn't fly. The Fool appeared first. He'd always been the weakest, all chaos and no strategy, more annoying than dangerous. But even the Fool was terrifying when you couldn't defend yourself properly. He attacked with his signature randomness, unpredictable movements, reality-bending chaos, the kind of fighting style that only worked if you didn't think about it too hard. Finn and Jake fought him while Marceline watched, frustrated by her own powerlessness. She'd spent centuries being strong enough to handle her own problems. Now she needed protection, needed others to fight her battles, needed to be saved instead of being the one who saved. The role reversal was humiliating and necessary in equal measure. They won. Barely. The fool was redefeated. His essence contained again. 1 down, 4 to go. The Empress came next. She'd been the manipulator, the vampire who controlled minds and treated other beings as puppets. Her power was psychological as much as physical. She'd get inside your head, make you doubt yourself, turn your own thoughts against you. Fighting her meant fighting yourself, and that was a battle you couldn't win with swords or punches. She targeted Marceline specifically. You took my power, little half-breed, wore it like clothing, but you never understood it, never accepted what it meant to be truly vampire. You played at being queen while rejecting everything that made us powerful. The Empress wasn't wrong. Marceline had taken vampire power but rejected vampire nature, had wanted the strength without the darkness, the immortality without the consumption. She'd been performing vampirism rather than embracing it, and the Empress saw that as fundamental weakness. I never wanted to be like you, Marceline shot back. I killed you because you were monsters. I took your power to make sure you couldn't hurt anyone else. And yet here we are, back again, because power doesn't die just because you're squeamish about using it properly. The fight with the Empress was psychological warfare wrapped in physical combat. She'd plant doubts while attacking, make you question your motivations while trying to drain your blood. Bubblegum helped with this one. Her scientific rationality worked as armor against mental manipulation. Can't manipulate someone whose primary defense mechanism is logic. They won again. 2 down. The Hierophant was ideology made flesh. He'd been righteous in his vampirism, had constructed entire philosophical frameworks to justify predation. To him, vampires were the next step in evolution, the superior beings who deserved to feed on lesser creatures. He'd made monstrosity sound noble, turned consuming life into divine right. You could have been great, he told Marceline during their confrontation. Instead, you became weak. Drinking red from apples? What pathetic rebellion. You have vampire power and demon blood and you use it for nothing. What a waste. Marceline had heard this before, from her father, from other demons, from the voice in her own head that sometimes wondered if rejecting her nature was just elaborate cowardice. The Hierophant was articulating her deepest fear, that choosing kindness over power made her less, not more, but she'd spent 1,000 years proving that fear wrong. She was powerful not despite rejecting her dark nature but because of it. Choosing to be better than her bloodline demanded was harder than giving in. Maintaining humanity while carrying demon and vampire power required more strength than just embracing the darkness. I'm not weak, she said. I'm choosing what I want to be. That's the opposite of weakness. The Hierophant fell. 3 down. The moon was sophisticated cruelty. She'd treated hunting as art, predation as performance. She was cultured and cruel in equal measure, the kind of monster who'd quote poetry while draining you. Her resurrection brought back that terrible elegance, that sense that being killed by her was somehow a privilege because at least she'd do it with style. She'd always unnerved Marceline more than the others. The fool was chaotic. The Empress was manipulative. The Hierophant was ideological. They were comprehensible forms of evil. The moon was incomprehensible. She was cruel because cruelty was aesthetically interesting. She hunted because hunting was beautiful. She had no deeper motivation than artistic satisfaction, which somehow made her more terrifying. You've gone soft, darling, the moon said, circling Marceline like she was appraising artwork. Mortality suits you in the worst way. You look almost human now. How disappointingly ordinary. The fight with the moon was about dignity. She wanted to reduce Marceline to prey, to prove that without vampire power, she was just another victim waiting to be consumed. Marceline fought to maintain her sense of self, to prove that her identity wasn't tied to her powers. She was Marceline with or without the vampirism. The creature she'd become mattered less than the person she'd chosen to be. They defeated the moon through teamwork. Finn's heroism, Jake's flexibility, Bubblegum's science, and Marceline's knowledge of how the moon fought. 4 down. The Vampire King was last. Of course he was last. He'd been the apex predator, the original vampire who'd ruled before Marceline killed him and took his crown. He was ancient and powerful, and absolutely furious about having been staked by a half-demon child centuries ago. His resurrection was the most dangerous because he was the most powerful, the one whose essence had granted Marceline most of her vampire abilities. He found her alone, separated her from the others because that's what apex predators do, isolate your prey before the kill. They faced each other in the ruins of something that used to be important, and the Vampire King smiled with too many teeth. Little Marceline, all grown up and defenseless. I should thank you, actually. You freed me from having to be responsible for the court. Now I can just hunt for pleasure again. You're not hunting anyone, Marceline said, trying to sound confident while being completely outmatched. I killed you once. I can do it again. You killed me when you had my power. Now you're just a girl with daddy issues and a bass guitar. What are you going to do, play me to death? Honestly, that wasn't the worst idea. The fight was brutal. The Vampire King didn't hold back, didn't toy with her, just went straight for the kill. Marceline dodged and ran and tried to use her environment as weapon, since her body couldn't be one anymore. She was outmatched physically, but knew him better than he knew himself. She'd absorbed his essence, spent centuries with his power, understood how he thought. She couldn't beat him alone. That was the realization that came mid-fight. She wasn't strong enough anymore. Mortality meant limitation, and this limitation was going to get her killed. She could accept that. Could die fighting the Vampire King and at least go out trying. Or she could call for help and admit that being vulnerable meant needing others. She called for help. Swallowed her pride and called for Finn and Jake and Bubblegum. Because surviving mattered more than ego, and she'd learned from Simon that sacrifice wasn't always noble. Sometimes it was just preventable tragedy. They arrived. Fought together. Combined their strengths against the Vampire King's power. But even working together, they were losing. The Vampire King was too strong, too fast, too experienced. He was going to win. He was going to kill them all, and then hunt freely across Ooh, and it would be Marceline's fault for releasing him by trying to become mortal. The choice became clear. She could stay mortal and watch her friends die, or she could reclaim the vampire power, become the Vampire Queen again, and save them. It wasn't really a choice. Marceline took back the vampire essence, let it flow into her again, felt the power return, felt herself become the thing she'd tried to stop being. The weight settled back on her shoulders like armour she'd briefly removed. She was the Vampire Queen again. Not by choice this time, but by necessity. Because people she loved needed her to be powerful more than she needed to be free. With her power restored, the fight turned. She matched the Vampire King's strength, countered his speed, used centuries of experience to predict his moves. They destroyed more ruins, shattered more remnants of the old world, fought with the kind of intensity that only happens between apex predators who genuinely might kill each other. She won, staked him again, absorbed his essence again, became fully vampire again. The Vampire King was defeated, re-dead, contained. The threat was over, and Marceline was back where she started, immortal, powerful, the Vampire Queen, unable to die, unable to escape the nature she'd tried to reject. The relief of mortality had lasted less than a week before reality reasserted itself. She was always going to be this, was always going to carry this burden, was always going to be the creature she'd become through survival. But something had changed. Not externally. She was still vampire, still immortal, still stuck. But internally, something had shifted. She'd chosen to become the Vampire Queen again. That was different from being forced into it through violence and survival. She'd made an active choice to carry this burden because people needed her to. That made it bearable. Not good, not wanted, but bearable. She was the Vampire Queen not because she'd killed vampires centuries ago, but because she'd chosen to protect people now. The power wasn't just inheritance anymore. It was responsibility she'd actively accepted. Bubblegum understood. She'd been terrified of Marceline becoming mortal because mortality meant loss, but she'd supported it anyway because Marceline needed the choice. Now Marceline had chosen to come back, and that choice mattered. It meant she wasn't trapped. She was staying. "I'm sorry," Bubblegum said after everything settled. "I should have been more supportive about you wanting to be mortal. That was your choice to make. I'm sorry I scared you, Marceline replied. I know what it's like to lose people. I shouldn't have made you face that possibility without considering your feelings. Growth. Actual growth. After 800 years of not communicating, they were finally learning how. The Stakes mini-series wasn't really about the vampires. They were the vehicle, the catalyst. But the story was about Marceline confronting her own nature. About whether you could reject what you were born as, what you'd become through trauma and violence, about whether identity was fixed or negotiable. The answer was both. She was the Vampire Queen. That was fact, unchangeable, part of her. But she was also Marceline, the girl with the stuffed animal, Simon's surrogate daughter, the musician who turned pain into art. The vampire part didn't erase the human part. She could be both, monster and person, powerful and vulnerable, dark and light. She'd tried to separate them by removing the vampirism, but the vampires coming back proved you can't escape your past by rejecting it. You can only integrate it, accept it, make peace with being complicated. She was a vampire who didn't drink blood. She was a demon who chose kindness. She was a queen who wanted to be vulnerable. All of it was true. All of it was her. Finn didn't fully understand what had happened. He saw it as adventure. Monsters attacked. They fought them. They won. Classic hero stuff. But Jake got it. Jake understood that Marceline had faced something deeper than physical threats. She'd faced the question of who she was, and the answer was more complicated than either becoming fully mortal or remaining fully vampire. You're you, Jake said simply. That's what matters. The vampire stuff is just details. It was reductive but also accurate. At the end of the day, beyond the powers and the immortality and the complicated supernatural biology, she was just Marceline. The rest was just how she moved through the world. She kept the vampirism, kept floating and the shadow manipulation and the immortality. But she understood it differently now. It wasn't a curse she was stuck with. It was a tool she chose to use. She could reject the predatory nature while accepting the power. Could be the vampire queen while maintaining her humanity. Could carry darkness without being consumed by it. The bass guitar felt different in her hands afterward. Still the same instrument, still her father's axe converted to music. But playing it felt like integration rather than rebellion. She wasn't fighting against her demon nature anymore. She was incorporating it, using it, making it serve her purposes rather than defining her. She wrote a song about it. Of course she did. Marceline processed everything through music. This one was about choosing yourself, about accepting complexity, about being more than one thing, about how you can be a monster and a person, powerful and vulnerable, ancient and eternally 17. The song was honest. No performance, no armor, just truth set to melody. She was the vampire queen. She was Marceline. Both things were real. Both things mattered. And maybe, just maybe, she could be both without it destroying her. Princess Bubblegum listened to the song and understood. This was growth. This was healing. This was Marceline finally making peace with herself after 1,000 years of internal conflict. I'm glad you're still here, Bubblegum said quietly. Me too, Marceline replied. And she meant it. The stakes had been survival, identity, and acceptance. Marceline survived, figured out her identity, accepted herself, complications and all. The vampires were defeated again, this time with the understanding that power wasn't the enemy. How you used it was what mattered. She floated out of the Candy Kingdom that night, bass guitar strapped to her back, feeling heavier and lighter simultaneously. The Vampire Queen, by choice this time. The girl who survived everything, still surviving, still choosing to exist despite the weight of existence. The adventure continued. It always did. But now she understood what she was continuing toward. Not escape from herself, but integration with herself. Not rejection of her nature, but acceptance of all her natures. The Vampire Queen played a song in the darkness. It sounded like peace. Marceline's father ate her fries, and that tells you everything you need to know about their relationship. Not metaphorically, literally. Hunson Abadir, Lord of the Nightosphere, ruler of chaotic evil, eater of souls, showed up to visit his daughter after centuries of absence, and the one thing she asked him not to do was eat her fries. She was explicit about it, clear, used actual words to express a simple boundary, and he ate them anyway because respecting boundaries requires understanding that other people's wants matter, and Hudson had never quite grasped that concept. The fries were just fries, but also they weren't just fries. They were a test, a boundary, a small thing that represented every big thing wrong with their relationship. Marceline had asked for one thing: don't eat the fries, and her father, who claimed to love her, who'd travelled from another dimension to see her, couldn't manage that basic level of respect. That's Hudson Aberdeen, loving and oblivious in equal measure, genuinely caring about his daughter while being fundamentally incapable of caring about her in ways that actually matter. He's not cruel. That would almost be easier. He's just so thoroughly disconnected from how relationships work that his attempts at connection consistently backfire. He's chaos incarnate. That's not metaphor either. He literally embodies chaotic evil, rules a dimension of it, exists as its physical manifestation. Morality for Hudson isn't a spectrum from good to bad. It's a foreign concept that other beings seem weirdly attached to. He doesn't understand why anyone would prioritize anything over their own amusement, or why causing suffering might be problematic. Not because he's actively malicious, but because empathy isn't part of his operational framework, and this is Marceline's dad. This is half her genetic inheritance. This is the being who gave her immortality, power, and a fundamental disconnect from conventional morality that she's spent 1,000 years trying to overcome. Their relationship is complicated in the way that parental relationships are complicated when one parent is the literal lord of evil and the other parent died in the apocalypse, leaving their half-demon daughter to figure out family dynamics alone. Marceline got her mother's empathy and her father's nature, and those two halves have been at war inside her for centuries. Hudson wasn't around for her childhood, obviously. He was in the Nightosphere doing Demon Lord things, and Earth was a different dimension, and his relationship with Marceline's mother had ended before Marceline was old enough to remember him clearly. He'd visit occasionally, brief appearances that were more disruptive than helpful, bringing chaos and confusion before disappearing back to his realm. The only consistent thing he gave her was the axe. His axe, actually. A weapon from the Nightosphere, capable of consuming souls, an artifact of pure destruction that he handed to his half-human daughter, because that's what you give children, right? Weapons of mass destruction. He genuinely thought it was a good gift. Thought she'd appreciate the power, the legacy, the inheritance of violence. Marceline turned it into a bass guitar. Took the weapon of destruction and made it an instrument of creation, modified it, strung it, transformed it from something that ended lives into something that expressed life. Her father gave her an axe. She made music. That transformation is their entire relationship in physical form. She kept it. That's important. She could have destroyed the axe, rejected it entirely, refused the gift. But she kept it, modified it, made it hers. Because rejecting your father completely means rejecting part of yourself. And Marceline had learned that rejection doesn't work. You can't cut out the demon half and expect to remain whole. You can only transform it, redirect it, make it serve different purposes. The axe base became her signature, her instrument, her weapon when necessary, her constant companion. Every time she played it, she was using her father's gift in ways he never intended, making beauty from brutality, creating connection from chaos, being her mother's daughter with her father's axe. It Came from the Nightosphere was the episode where everything about their dysfunction became unavoidable. Marceline was playing a show, performing for an audience, when she casually mentioned her dad. Finn, being Finn, got curious, asked about him. Marceline, being Marceline, said he was the Lord of Evil and left it at that, assuming everyone would drop it. Finn did not drop it. Finn decided to summon him, because Finn's solution to curiosity is always action, usually ill-advised action. He found a ritual, followed the steps, and accidentally opened a portal to the Nightosphere. And through that portal came Hudson Aberdeen, dressed in a business suit, ready to consume souls and catch up with his daughter. Marceline was mortified, not scared. She knew her dad wasn't going to hurt her, just deeply, profoundly embarrassed in the way you're embarrassed when your parent shows up uninvited to your social event and immediately starts being weird. Hudson was being himself, which meant casual soul consumption and complete obliviousness to social norms, and Marceline had to explain to her friends that yes, this was her father. No, she couldn't control him. Please just ignore the soul-eating. Hudson was delighted to see her. Genuinely happy. He hugged her, asked about her life, wanted to know what she'd been up to for the past few centuries. The affection was real. The complete failure to understand appropriate behaviour was also real. He loved her in the way demons love, intensely but without consideration for the loved one's actual needs or boundaries. "I brought you something," he said, pulling out a small soul creature from his pocket. "Thought you might be hungry. These are particularly delicious. They scream in 3-part harmony. Dad, I don't eat souls. I told you that." "I don't even drink blood anymore." Right, you're on that weird diet. How's that working out? You look thin. Are you getting enough suffering in your diet? You need suffering for proper nutrition." He wasn't joking. This was genuine fatherly concern filtered through the worldview of a being who thought suffering was a food group. He wanted his daughter to be healthy by his standards, which were completely incompatible with her standards, and he couldn't understand why that was a problem. The fries happened later. They were hanging out, or attempting to hang out, or doing whatever demons and their half-demon daughters do when trying to have family time. Marceline had French fries. Simple food, nothing fancy, just something she was eating because she was hungry and fries are good. She offered some to her father because that's what you do, you share food with family. "These are terrible," Hudson said, tasting one. "They have no soul in them at all, just potato and salt. Where's the existential dread? The essence of suffering? They're French fries, Dad. They're just food." "Oh, well, they're still terrible." Later, Marceline had to step away for a minute. Had to deal with something, handle some business, the usual chaos of existing in a post-apocalyptic magical land. She left the fries, came back to find them gone. Her father was sitting there, looking satisfied, completely unaware that he'd done anything wrong. "Did you eat my fries?" "What?" "Oh yes. They were there, so I consumed them. That's what we do with things that exist. Consume them. I told you not to eat them. I specifically said don't eat my fries while I'm gone." "Did you? I don't remember that. Are you sure you said that?" He wasn't gaslighting her. He genuinely didn't remember because the request hadn't registered as important. His daughter's explicit boundary was just noise to him, background sound that didn't warrant retention. He'd heard the words without processing that they meant something, that they expressed a want he was supposed to respect. Marceline wrote a song about it. The Fry Song. A performance piece that expressed her frustration through music because direct communication with her father never worked. She sang about trust and boundaries and the small ways people hurt you by not caring enough to remember what you asked them not to do. She made it funny, made it light, turned legitimate hurt into entertainment because that's how she processed everything. Hudson watched the performance, enjoyed it, applauded, and completely missed that it was about him, about his failure, about the ways he consistently let her down while thinking he was being a good father. That was their dynamic. He'd show up, mean well, cause chaos, fail to understand why Marceline was upset, and leave thinking everything was fine. She'd be hurt, write a song about it, process her feelings through music and prepare for the next inevitable disappointment. They loved each other across a gap neither could fully bridge. Him because he lacked the emotional capacity, her because she'd learned that expecting more was just setting herself up for pain. The nightosphere itself was the inheritance Marceline kept refusing. Her father wanted her to rule it, to take over when he eventually got bored or moved on to other dimensions. It was hers by birthright. She was half demon, his daughter, the heir to chaos itself. The realm was waiting for her. The throne was technically hers. All she had to do was accept it. She didn't accept it. Never would. The nightosphere represented everything she'd spent her existence rejecting. Predation, chaos, the casual consumption of other beings. It was her father's kingdom, built on suffering, maintained through evil, operating on principles she found morally repugnant. Taking that throne would mean becoming him, and she'd decided centuries ago that becoming Hudson Abadir was her personal nightmare. Daddy's little monster was when that rejection became explicit. Her father visited again, tried again to convince her to embrace her demon nature, showed her the amulet, his amulet, the source of his power, the artifact that granted dominion over the nightosphere. He wanted to pass it to her, make the inheritance official, give her the power that came with being his daughter. Just try it on, he said. See how it feels. You might like being supremely powerful and feared throughout multiple dimensions. Marceline refused, flat out said no. But Hudson was persistent in his oblivious way, and circumstances conspired. Finn got involved, the amulet got activated, and Marceline ended up wearing it, ended up transformed by its power, becoming the thing her father had always wanted her to be. The amulet turned her into a demon. Not half demon, but full demon. It brought out the Hudson Abadir half of her inheritance, pushed down the human half, made her powerful and terrible, and exactly what she'd been fighting against for 1,000 years. She was her father, consuming, chaotic, operating without empathy or restraint. The monster she'd always feared becoming was suddenly what she was, and she hated it. Viscerally hated the feeling of being that creature, of wanting to consume, of finding suffering amusing. It was her nature, the inheritance she carried, but it wasn't her choice. It wasn't who she'd decided to be. The amulet forced her demon half to the surface, and meeting that part of herself directly was horrifying. Finn fought her, had to fight her because she was dangerous, because the demon Marceline was hurting people, because someone needed to stop her. And Marceline, buried under the demon influence, was grateful for it. Wanted to be stopped. Wanted someone to care enough to fight against what she was becoming, even if it meant fighting her. He got the amulet off. She returned to normal, to her usual half-demon state where she could choose kindness over consumption. And her father was disappointed. Not angry, not upset, just confused about why she'd reject power that was rightfully hers. You could be so much more, Hudson said. You have potential, all this power inside you, and you waste it on being good. What a strange choice. It's not a waste, Marceline replied. It's a choice. I'm choosing what I want to be. But why would you choose to be weak when you could be strong? I'm not weak. I'm just not you. That was the crux of it. Marceline's entire existence was about not being her father. She had his power, his immortality, his potential for chaos and destruction, but she chose differently. Chose her mother's empathy over her father's amorality. Chose creation over consumption. Chose to be half demon who acted human rather than half human who acted demon. Hudson didn't understand. Couldn't understand. To him, rejecting power was incomprehensible. Power was good by definition. More power was better. Using that power without restraint was optimal. Why his daughter would choose limitation over potential was a mystery he couldn't solve. But he loved her anyway. In his broken, insufficient way, he loved her. He kept visiting, kept trying to connect, kept offering her the nightosphere like someday she'd change her mind. He couldn't give her what she actually needed. Emotional presence, boundaries, respect, understanding. But he gave what he could. His time, his attention, his genuine belief that she was special and important. Return to the nightosphere showed their relationship evolving slightly. Marceline had to visit her father's realm, needed something from the nightosphere for reasons that seemed important at the time. She brought Finn and Jake, partly for help and partly for moral support when dealing with family dysfunction. The nightosphere was exactly as terrible as expected. Suffering as far as the eye could see, demons enjoying the suffering, chaos operating as governing principle. Hudson gave her a tour like a proud parent showing off their workplace, completely missing that his daughter found the whole operation morally disgusting. This is the pit of eternal screaming, he explained cheerfully. Very popular. The screaming is in excellent acoustics, really resonates. And over here is where we keep the souls who are mean to animals. We make them experience what they inflicted, but like, forever. It's great. Dad, this is torture. You're describing torture. Well, yes, that's what we do here. They're evil souls being punished for evil. It's a whole system. Very organised, actually. You'd be impressed by the bureaucracy. She wasn't impressed. But she was starting to understand him better. The nightosphere wasn't random cruelty. It had logic, purpose, structure. It was cosmic justice filtered through demonic administration. Her father wasn't just chaos. He was chaos with a filing system. That didn't make it good, but it made it comprehensible. They had moments, brief flashes of actual connection, where Hudson would accidentally say something paternal and appropriate, where he'd show concern that wasn't filtered through demonic worldview, where he'd almost understand what Marceline needed from him. "I'm proud of you, you know," he said during one visit. "You've made something of yourself, built a life. You're successful in your own way, even if it's weird and confusing to me." "Thanks, Dad." That almost sounded like a normal father compliment. Did it? I've been practicing. There's a book in the Nightosphere about human emotions. Very complicated stuff. Apparently people want to be acknowledged. Strange system. He was trying. In his deeply inadequate way, Hudson was trying to be better at fathering. He'd never be good at it. His nature prevented that. But he was making effort, which for a being of pure chaotic evil was actually kind of remarkable. He cared enough to try, even if his trying was comically insufficient. Marceline learned to accept that. Learned that her father would never be the parent she needed, but he was the parent she had, and there was love there even if it was expressed badly. She set boundaries, enforced them when he inevitably crossed them, and forgave him when his violations came from obliviousness rather than malice. The axe base remained their connection. Music was the one language they shared, the one place where communication worked. Hudson didn't understand empathy or boundaries or emotional availability, but he understood power and creation, and the way sound could affect reality. When Marceline played the bass, when she made music from his weapon, he got it. Understood that this was her using his gift, her honouring the inheritance while transforming it into something better. She'd never rule the Nightosphere. That was permanent. The throne would stay empty or go to someone else or just cease to exist. She didn't care. She wasn't interested in power for its own sake, in ruling a dimension of suffering, in being the queen of chaos. She was already a queen. The Vampire Queen. That was enough crowns for one immortal. But she could have a relationship with her father. Complicated, frustrating, limited, but real. She could love him while rejecting what he represented. Could honour her demon heritage while refusing to become demonic. Could be his daughter without being his heir. Marcy and Hudson happened much later, after centuries of this complicated dynamic. They tried to have a normal father-daughter day, which was hilarious because nothing about either of them was normal. They went to a concert together, tried to enjoy music as a shared activity, attempted to just exist in proximity without cosmic chaos intervening. It went badly, of course. Hudson's presence attracted demons, Marceline's presence attracted adventure, and their combined presence basically guaranteed something would go catastrophically wrong. But they tried. They made the effort, and in the trying, they found something resembling peace. "I know I'm not a great dad," Hudson admitted at one point. "I'm chaos itself. I don't really do the whole stable parental figure thing, but I do love you, in my way, even if my way is objectively terrible by most standards. I know, Dad, and I love you too, even though you're literally the worst sometimes. Literally the worst is my title, actually. Lord of Evil, literally the worst. It's on my business cards." She laughed. He was ridiculous, impossible, fundamentally broken as a parent. But he was hers, her father, her inheritance, her demon half-made flesh. She'd spent centuries trying to not be him, and she'd succeeded. She was Marceline, not Hudson. But she was Marceline partly because she was his daughter, because she carried his power and chose to use it differently. The rejection of toxic inheritance didn't mean rejecting family. It meant accepting family while refusing to repeat their patterns. She could love her father without becoming him, could honour her demon nature without being consumed by it, could be both Hudson's daughter and her own person, simultaneously, without contradiction. That was growth. That was healing. That was 1,000 years of figuring out that family's complicated and that's okay. You don't have to fix people to love them. You don't have to approve of everything they are to maintain relationship with them. You just have to be clear about who you are and what you'll accept, and let them be who they are within those boundaries. Hudson would never fully understand her, would never be the father she'd needed as a child, the parent who could have made the apocalypse easier, but he was the father she had now, and now was what mattered. They had their music, their awkward visits, their mutual confusion about each other's life choices. It wasn't perfect. It was enough. Marceline floated in her house, bass guitar in hand, thinking about her father and the nightosphere and the inheritance she'd rejected. The axe thrummed with demonic energy, transformed into music. Her father's power, her mother's heart, her own choice about how to combine them. She played a riff, dark and light simultaneously, chaotic but controlled, demon power channeled into human expression. It sounded like family, complicated, imperfect, but undeniably real. The Lord of the Nightosphere was a terrible father, but he was her terrible father, and she was his impossible daughter. And they loved each other across that gap, badly and imperfectly and persistently. Sometimes that's all family can be. Sometimes it's enough. The bass guitar sang in the darkness. Chaos made melody, and Marceline smiled despite herself. Her father had eaten her fries, but he'd also given her this, the ability to turn destruction into creation, to make beauty from brutality, to be more than her inheritance demanded. That was worth something. Maybe even worth the fries. The bass guitar has been in Marceline's hands longer than most civilizations have existed, and every scratch on its surface tells a story she can't speak out loud. Music is how Marceline remembers, not just facts or events, but how those facts and events felt, what they meant, why they mattered. Memory fades when you're immortal. Centuries blur together. Faces merge. Conversations dissolve into the general noise of existing too long, but songs stay. Melodies preserve what prose can't. 3 chords and the truth, except when you're a 1,000-year-old vampire queen, the truth requires more than 3 chords and an entire eternity to process. The axe bass is her autobiography. Her father's weapon transformed into her instrument. Destruction converted to creation. Violence made into vulnerability. Every time she plays it, she's using Hudson Abadir's gift in ways he never intended, and her mother would have loved. It's both halves of her inheritance working together, demon power channeled through human expression, chaos organized into music, inherited darkness made into chosen light. She's had other instruments, tried other ways of making sound, but the axe bass is the one that's stuck, the one that matters, the one that's been with her through everything. It's older than the Candy Kingdom, older than most of Oo's current geography, older than everyone except her and the Ice King. It's witnessed her entire post-apocalyptic existence and absorbed every emotion she couldn't otherwise express. The strings have been replaced hundreds of times. The wood has been repaired, reinforced, maintained across centuries of use. But it's still the same bass, the same axe, the same physical connection to her father and her choice to be different from him. It's the most important object in her possession, more valuable than Hambo even, because Hambo represents who she was and the bass represents who she became. Music is Marceline's primary language. She speaks English, sure, and probably a dozen dead languages from before the Mushroom War. But music is how she communicates truth, how she processes trauma, how she expresses love and hurt and fear and hope, without having to articulate them in ways that require vulnerability she's not ready to offer. The songs say what she can't, feel what she won't, express what she's buried under centuries of defensive armor. Every song is a memory crystallized, a moment preserved in melody that won't fade the way normal memories fade. She can forget conversations, forget faces, forget entire decades of wandering through ooh. But she never forgets a song. The music stays encoded perfectly, accessible forever. A filing system for emotions and experiences that would otherwise dissolve into the general blur of immortality. Frysong is about her father, obviously. The most passive-aggressive musical expression of family dysfunction ever written, wrapped in a catchy melody that makes it sound light and fun rather than deeply painful. She turned her father's casual disregard for boundaries into entertainment, made his emotional obliviousness into something audiences could enjoy, transformed legitimate hurt into performance art. I'm going to bury you in the ground, lying there forever, never to be found. You'll be crying out, but nobody will hear your call. I'm going to drink the red from your pretty pink face. When sung about French fries becomes absolutely hilarious until you realise what she's actually singing about. Trust violated, boundaries ignored, the small betrayals that represent every large betrayal her father has ever committed. The song is funny because it's disproportionate, Getting that angry about fries is absurd, but the anger isn't about fries. It's about 1,000 years of her father failing to care about what she cares about, failing to remember what she asks him to remember, failing to be present in ways that matter. The fries are just the most recent example of a pattern that started before the apocalypse and continues every time Hunson visits. She performs Fry Song, with genuine rage wrapped in playful delivery. The contradiction is intentional. She's simultaneously expressing real emotion and making it safe for consumption by making it comedic. That's how Marceline operates. Deep feelings disguised as surface humour, vulnerability masked as performance, real pain presented as entertainment so nobody has to actually engage with how not okay she is. I'm Just Your Problem is the song that broke everyone who was paying attention to Adventure Time's subtext. Marceline performing directly at Princess Bubblegum, making 800 years of unprocessed feelings into a 3-minute musical attack, expressing everything she'd been avoiding saying through direct, angry, desperate melody. I'm gonna drink the red from your pretty pink face appears here too, but with different meaning. When it's about her father, it's about consuming what he represents, taking his casual cruelty and making it hers to express. When it's about Bubblegum, it's about wanting to crack that perfect pink composure, to make her feel something, to get through the scientific rationality to the person underneath. The song is called I'm Just Your Problem, but it's really called Please Acknowledge That I Exist and That Hurting Me Matters. Marceline sings about being a bad guy, being a problem, being inadequate and annoying, all things Bubblegum never actually said but Marceline internalised anyway. She's externalising her own fears, performing her insecurities, begging for contradiction through accusation. Sorry I don't treat you like you're perfect, like all your little loyal subjects do. Sorry I'm not made of sugar, am I not sweet enough for you? That line hits different when you understand what they were to each other. Bubblegum is literally made of sugar. Marceline is literally not. The Candy Princess and the Vampire Queen, opposite in nature, incompatible in fundamental ways, and yet Marceline is apologising for not being something she could never be. Apologising for being herself instead of what Bubblegum needed her to be. The performance is aggressive vulnerability, Marceline wearing her hurt as weapon, turning pain into attack, expressing love through anger because anger is safer than admitting she's devastated. The song says, I don't care about you, while obviously caring so much it's destroying her. It says we're just nothing, while clearly desperate for them to be something. Bubblegum sat through it, just listened, absorbed the musical assault, maintained her composure while Marceline fell apart in melody. That composure was both what Marceline loved and hated about her. The ability to remain rational in the face of emotion, to not be shaken by feelings, to keep functioning when everything was falling apart. But Bubblegum wasn't unaffected. She just processed differently. While Marceline expressed through music, PB retreated into science, into fixing things, into maintaining control as defense against feeling too much. They were both drowning, just in different languages. Everything Stays is different, softer, written later, after centuries of pain had been processed into something resembling acceptance. It's about change and loss, and the ways things transform while remaining fundamentally themselves. It's about her mother, about Simon, about everyone she's loved and lost. It's about immortality's central tragedy, watching everything change while you stay the same. Everything stays right where you left it. Everything stays, but it still changes. Ever so slightly, daily and nightly, in little ways. When everything stays. The song is deceptively simple. Sounds like a lullaby, like something you'd sing to children. But it's carrying the weight of 1,000 years of watching people age and die, of seeing civilizations rise and fall, of being the constant in a world of variables. Everything stays the same and everything changes simultaneously, and Marceline has to witness both truths forever. She sang this to young Princess Bubblegum in a flashback, or Bubblegum remembers her singing it, or they shared it somehow in their early days together. It became their song in ways I'm Just Your Problem never could be. Not aggressive, not defensive, just honest about what it means to exist across time. Bubblegum is immortal too, faces the same existential weight, understands that staying means watching everything else change around you. The song is acceptance. Not happy acceptance, not peaceful acceptance, just acknowledgement that this is how things are. Everything stays and everything changes, and you can hold both truths, and holding them doesn't make them hurt less, but it makes them hurt differently. Bearable hurt instead of breaking hurt. Monster comes later still. During the Stakes miniseries when Marceline was confronting her vampire nature directly. It's introspective in ways her other songs aren't. Not performed at anyone, not expressing anger or love, just examining herself and asking the question she'd been avoiding for centuries, am I the monster I'm afraid of becoming? The song lists her traits, her power, her darkness, her capacity for violence, and asks whether those traits make her monstrous. It's vulnerable without being weak, honest without being defensive. She's genuinely questioning her own nature, wondering if choosing not to be a monster is enough when you carry monster potential inside you forever. The answer the song arrives at is ambiguous. She is powerful, she is dark, she could be a monster. But she chooses not to be, and maybe that choice is what matters. Maybe being capable of monstrosity but rejecting it is more heroic than simply not being capable of it at all. Maybe the struggle is the point. That's growth. That's 1,000 years of self-examination condensed into music. Young Marceline would have denied being a monster at all, would have insisted she was good and separate from darkness. Older Marceline acknowledges the darkness, examines it, and chooses what to do with it. She's integrated her shadow instead of rejecting it, accepted her complexity instead of fighting it. Time Adventure is the finale song, the culmination of everything. It's not Marceline's song alone, BMO contributes, the moment is collaborative, but Marceline's voice carries it, and her experience gives it weight. It's about time, memory, friendship, and the ways we're changed by people we love. Time is an illusion that helps things make sense, so we're always living in the present tense. It seems unforgiving when a good thing ends, but you and I will always be back then. The song is about immortality from the opposite direction. Not the burden of living forever, but the gift of moments being eternal once they've happened. Marceline has lived 1,000 years, but she still exists in every moment she's ever experienced. Still the little girl with Simon, still the vampire hunter, still Bubblegum's girlfriend the first time, still floating in her house at 17. All of it is permanent, preserved, always accessible. Time doesn't really pass when you're immortal. It accumulates. Marceline isn't moving through time linearly, she's expanding outward, containing all her previous selves simultaneously. She's the child and the adult, the victim and the survivor, the monster and the hero, all at once. Time is an illusion that helps things make sense, and she's living proof that sense is optional. She sings Time Adventure as reality collapses around them, as Golb threatens everything, as the finale approaches and endings become possible. The song is defiant, refusing to let the moment be ruined by fear of losing it, choosing to celebrate connection even when connection is temporary. It's every lesson she's learned across a millennium, compressed into melody. Music as coping mechanism makes sense when you've existed as long as Marceline. You need ways to process centuries of accumulated experience, and talking about it doesn't work because who can you talk to? Who shares your reference points? Who understands what it's like to watch the world end and rebuild and transform? Nobody, except maybe Bubblegum, and PB processes through science rather than art, so Marceline plays. Turns emotions into music, experiences into songs, trauma into performance art. The bass becomes therapy, composition becomes processing, performance becomes communication. She's been doing this for so long it's automatic. Something hurts, write a song about it. Something matters, express it musically. Something needs to be remembered, encode it in melody. The performance aspect is important too. Marceline doesn't just play alone. She performs for audiences, shares her music, makes her internal experience external and public. That's vulnerability disguised as entertainment. She's exposing herself completely while maintaining the defense of performance, letting people see her while keeping them at arm's length. When she plays for Finn and Jake and BMO, when she performs at the Candy Kingdom, when she jam sessions with random ooh citizens, she's connecting without committing, being present without being available, showing herself without being fully seen. The music creates intimacy while maintaining distance. It's the perfect coping mechanism for someone who desperately wants connection, but is terrified of the loss that comes with it. Rebecca Sugar's influence on Marceline's musical identity can't be ignored when talking about the meta element of these songs. Sugar was a writer and storyboard artist for Adventure Time, and her musical sensibility shaped how Marceline expressed herself. The queer subtext that became text, the emotional complexity wrapped in whimsy, the way songs could carry narrative weight, that was Sugar's contribution. Everything Stays especially bears Sugar's fingerprints. The deceptively simple melody containing complex emotional truth, the way it functions as both children's lullaby and existential meditation. Sugar understood that you could have depth and accessibility simultaneously, that kids' shows could tackle adult emotional complexity if you wrapped it in the right packaging. Marceline's songs work as narrative shorthand too. Adventure Time learned early that you could convey character development, emotional state, and relationship dynamics through a 3-minute song more effectively than through dialogue. Music bypasses intellectual defenses, hits emotional centers directly, communicates faster and deeper than words. When Marceline plays, the audience knows she's being real. The songs are her most honest self, the place where all her defenses drop. She can lie in conversation, can perform detachment, can pretend she's fine. But the music doesn't lie. The music is always truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. The axe bass thrums with demonic energy converted to sound waves, with inherited power used for creation rather than destruction. Every note is a choice, to be different from her father, to honour her mother, to express rather than suppress, to connect rather than isolate. The instrument is a rebellion and a love letter simultaneously, chaos made into order, made into chaos again, but controlled chaos, intentional chaos, chaos in service of meaning. Marceline has forgotten plenty over her 1,000 years. Faces blur, names escape her, entire decades merge into undifferentiated time. But she remembers every song, every melody she's written, every lyric she's composed, every performance she's given. The music is her most reliable memory, her most permanent record, her truest self preserved across centuries. She plays alone often, just sits in her house, floating upside down, and plays for an audience of none. Those are the most important performances, not for others, but for herself. Playing to process, to remember, to feel connected to her own history. The songs are conversations with her past selves, dialogues across time, ways of maintaining continuity when everything else fragments. The bass sings in the darkness of her cave, and Marceline sings with it. Songs about her father, her lost love, her surrogate dad who lost himself, her complicated feelings about immortality and power, and being stuck at 17 forever. Songs about survival and loneliness, and the specific quality of heartbreak when you have eternity to feel it. Music is how Marceline stays sane, or sane adjacent, or functional enough to keep existing across impossible spans of time. It's how she transforms suffering into beauty, how she makes meaning from chaos, how she proves that art is survival, and survival is art. The Vampire Queen plays her bass in the ruins of civilization, in the Candy Kingdom, in ice castles and grasslands and everywhere in between. She plays because playing is breathing, because music is language, because some truths can only be expressed in melody. She plays because she's Marceline, daughter of chaos, survivor of apocalypse, the girl who turned a weapon into an instrument and made that transformation her whole identity. She plays because everything stays, but it still changes, and music is how you hold both truths simultaneously without breaking. The bass guitar sings, Marceline sings. The songs accumulate like memories, like scars, like evidence that living for 1,000 years means something beyond just surviving that long. And somewhere in the melody, in the space between notes, in the vibration of strings converting emotion into sound, that's where Marceline exists most fully. Not the Vampire Queen, not the Demon's Daughter, not the survivor or the wanderer or any role she's played. Just Marceline, making music. Turning her pain into something beautiful. That's what matters. That's what lasts. The songs remain. The end of the world happened on a Tuesday, or maybe a Thursday. Time gets weird when reality starts collapsing, and Marceline had never been great with calendars anyway. Golb arrived in like the universe's worst houseguest. bringing chaos in its most literal and terrible form. Not the fun chaos, not the Hunts and Abadir, let's eat some souls and see what happens chaos, but fundamental chaos. The kind that dissolved meaning itself, that turned structure into void, that threatened to undo everything the land of Oo had become. The ultimate negation, the anti-existence, the thing that made the Mushroom War look like a minor inconvenience. Marceline had survived the apocalypse before. She'd watched human civilization end, had lived through the transformation of Earth into Oo, had witnessed the impossible become mundane. But Golb was different. Golb wasn't transformation. It was termination. Complete erasure of everything, including the weird magical reality that had grown from the ashes of the old world. For the first time in centuries, Marceline faced the genuine possibility of ending. Not dying eventually, not aging into mortality, but just ceasing. Her, Bubblegum, Finn, Jake, BMO, the Ice King, the Candy Kingdom, all of Oo, just gone, dissolved into chaos, unmade at the fundamental level. 1,000 years of survival about to be rendered meaningless by a chaos god having a bad day. She should have been terrified. She was terrified. But also, and this surprised her, she was ready. Not ready to die, but ready to fight for living. Ready to stand with people she loved and refuse erasure. Ready to matter, to make her existence count for something beyond just accumulating centuries. The battle was everyone. Finn with his sword and his ridiculous heroic optimism. Jake stretching and fighting with his usual creative chaos. Princess Bubblegum coordinating defences with scientific precision. BMO being BMO, which was somehow both adorable and weirdly effective. The Ice King doing ice things, his madness accidentally useful in fighting literal chaos. And Marceline, the Vampire Queen, using every ounce of her demon power and vampire abilities to combat the thing trying to unmake reality. They fought alongside each other, not as individuals, but as a unit, as friends, as found family. Marceline realised mid-battle that this collection of weird people she'd accidentally let into her life was what she'd been surviving for. Not immortality for its own sake, but immortality shared with people who made eternity worth experiencing. She saw the Ice King struggling, saw him confused and frightened and trying to help despite having no idea what was happening. Saw Simon's body being used by the Crown to fight something Simon's mind couldn't comprehend. And she made a decision she'd been avoiding for centuries. She flew to him, protected him, fought alongside him like they were still surviving the apocalypse together. "I got you, Simon," she said, even though he didn't recognise her, even though the Ice King just looked confused about why the vampire girl was being nice to him. "I'm keeping you safe. Just like you did for me." The promise reversed. The child who'd been protected now protecting the protector, even though the protector couldn't remember making the original promise. Simon had used the crown until there was no Simon left. The least Marceline could do was make sure the Ice King survived long enough for Simon to maybe, possibly, somehow return. Betty Groff appeared then, Simon's fiancée from before the Mushroom War, the one who'd been searching for him across time and dimensions, the one who'd never given up trying to save him from the Crown's influence. She'd found a way to reach Golb, to make a wish, to change reality itself. And her wish was simple, devastating, and completely in character. She wished to keep Simon safe, to protect him from the Crown, to sacrifice herself so he could be free. The Crown dissolved. The Ice King's madness lifted. And for the first time in 1,000 years, Simon Petrikov was just Simon again. Confused, disoriented, suddenly middle-aged instead of frozen in time, but himself. Actually, himself. The man who'd sung to a little girl in the apocalypse returned after being lost for longer than most people lived. Marceline saw him. Really saw him. Simon, not the Ice King. The person she'd been missing for a millennium, suddenly present, suddenly possible, and she couldn't process it, couldn't handle the weight of that moment while reality was still collapsing, so she just kept fighting, kept moving, kept existing because they all needed to survive this before she could deal with what Simon's return meant. Betty was gone, merged with Golb, or transformed into something else, or sacrificed completely. Marceline wasn't entirely sure, but Simon was free. The Crown's hold was broken. After 1,000 years of madness, after Betty spending decades searching for a cure, after everyone giving up on Simon ever being Simon again. He was back, at the cost of Betty's existence, but back. That was the cruelest kind of salvation. Simon got his mind back, but lost the person who'd loved him enough to give up everything. He'd been saved at the cost of never getting to be with his saviour. Love and loss wrapped together so tightly they became the same thing. Reality stabilised. Golb retreated, or was defeated, or just got bored. Chaos gods aren't great about providing clear narrative resolution, but who survived? Everyone survived. The world was still there, still weird, still magical and broken and beautiful. They'd won somehow through combination of heroism and friendship, and sheer stubborn refusal to be unmade. And then, in the aftermath, when the immediate threat was over, and everyone was catching their breath and trying to process what had happened, Marceline looked at Princess Bubblegum. Just looked at her. Centuries of complicated history, 800 years of unprocessed feelings, recent reconciliation still tentative and careful. All of it present in that look. Bubblegum looked back, saw Marceline, really saw her, the way she'd been learning to see her again after centuries of deliberately not looking. Saw the Vampire Queen who'd just fought to save reality, who'd protected the Ice King because he used to be Simon, who'd been ready to end if it meant the people she loved could continue. Saw her fully, finally, without the walls they'd both been maintaining. They moved toward each other. No words, no discussion, no careful negotiation of what this meant or whether they were ready. Just movement, connection, closing the distance they'd been maintaining for so long, and they kissed. In front of everyone, in front of Finn and Jake and BMO and all of Ooh. A public declaration that they were together, that they'd figured out their stuff, that after centuries of hurting each other, they were choosing to try again. The kiss was everything. Confirmation of subtext that had been building for years. Two women who loved each other, who'd had a relationship and broken up and found each other again, who were choosing each other in front of the entire land of Ooh. It was queer love made canon, visible, undeniable. It was Marceline and Bubblegum saying, "We're done hiding this. We're done pretending it's complicated when actually it's simple. We love each other." For a generation that grew up with Adventure Time, that moment mattered beyond just the story. It was representation that validated, that said queer love gets happy endings too, that said two women could be the emotional core of a show, and their love could be the resolution of their arc. It wasn't subtext or implication or reading between lines. It was text, it was canon, it was Bubbline finally, officially, undeniably together. Marceline had spent 1,000 years alone, or with people she'd lose, or in relationships that hurt more than they healed. Now she wasn't alone. Now she had someone who was also immortal, who understood the weight of forever, who'd chosen to spend that forever with her. That was revolutionary. That was healing. That was everything she'd needed without knowing she needed it. The world continued. It always did. Ooh kept being weird. Finn and Jake kept having adventures. The Candy Kingdom kept functioning. But something fundamental had shifted. Marceline wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. Actually living. Not just accumulating years, but experiencing them, sharing them, making them matter. Simon adjusted to being Simon again. It was hard. He'd lost Betty, had missed 1,000 years, had memories of being the Ice King that horrified and confused him. Marceline helped where she could, carefully, trying to rebuild their relationship without expecting it to be what it was. He was different now. She was different now. They'd both survived their own kinds of apocalypse, but they could try. They could figure out what Simon and Marceline looked like when both of them were actually present. "I'm sorry," Simon said one day, sitting in Marceline's house, looking at photographs of them from centuries ago. "I'm sorry I left you. I know I didn't mean to. I know the crown made me, but I still left. You were just a kid and I left you alone." "You saved me," Marceline replied. "You used the crown until there was no you left, and you did it to keep me safe. That's not leaving." "That's the opposite of leaving?" "I don't remember most of it. Being the Ice King, just fragments, impressions. But I remember you. Not the details, but the feeling. That I loved you. That you mattered more than anything. You still loved me. Even as the Ice King, even when you couldn't remember my name, you were still trying to protect everyone you met. That was you, Simon. That was always you. They cried together, processed together, started building something new from the wreckage of what they'd been. It wasn't the same, couldn't be the same, but it was real, and it was healing, and it was proof that sometimes people come back, even when you've spent centuries accepting that they won't. Obsidian happened later, the distant land special that showed Marceline and Bubblegum actually in a relationship, working through their issues like adults, being together in ways that felt earned and real and complicated. They went on a mission together to face Marceline's past. Literally, a dragon she'd made a deal with centuries ago, a promise that had come due. The dragon was named Larvo, and it represented everything Marceline had been running from. Her past, her mistakes, her tendency to make deals and commitments she couldn't keep, because keeping them required vulnerability she wasn't capable of then. The dragon had been sleeping under a town, and now it was waking up, and Marceline had to face it because that's what you do when your past comes back demanding payment. Bubblegum came with her. Didn't have to, didn't need to, just chose to because that's what partners do. They face things together, and watching Bubblegum be supportive without trying to fix everything, watching her be present without taking over, that was growth. That was PB learning that love doesn't mean solving all of someone's problems for them. Sometimes love is just being there while they solve it themselves. The dragon fight was about more than just defeating a monster. It was about Marceline confronting the person she'd been when she made that deal, accepting that she'd hurt people, acknowledging her own capacity for harm while refusing to be defined by it. She'd made mistakes. She'd been reckless and selfish and afraid. But she wasn't that person anymore. Growth doesn't erase the past. It just means you're different now, capable of different choices. They defeated the dragon through combination of Marceline's power and Bubblegum's science, and their ability to work together without falling into old patterns. No fighting about approach, no Bubblegum trying to control everything, no Marceline sabotaging through chaos. Just two people who knew each other completely, who'd hurt each other deeply, who'd chosen to try anyway, fighting side by side, trusting each other, being themselves together. After the battle, they had the conversation they'd been avoiding for 800 years, actually talked about what went wrong, why they broke up, what they needed from each other. It was uncomfortable and necessary and long overdue. They apologized. They acknowledged hurt. They talked about boundaries and needs and the ways they'd failed each other. I needed you to be more organized, Bubblegum admitted, to fit into my kingdom, my plans, my way of existing, and that was wrong. You're not meant to fit. You're meant to be exactly what you are. I needed you to be less rational, Marceline replied, to just feel things without analyzing them, and that was wrong too. You process through logic. That's valid. I can't demand you be more like me. They learned each other again, differently this time, with the wisdom of centuries and the honesty of people who'd already lost each other and refused to repeat it. They found the space where their differences could coexist, where compromise didn't feel like surrender, where love was big enough to hold their contradictions. What Marceline represented ultimately was the possibility of healing from trauma without erasing it. She carried the apocalypse, Simon's loss, 800 years of loneliness, her father's darkness, her vampire nature, all of it. And she didn't let it define her. She integrated it, accepted it, made it part of who she was without letting it be all of who she was. Trauma informed her but didn't control her. The past mattered but didn't determine the future. She represented queer love that was messy and complicated and real. Not sanitized or easy or perfect, but genuine. Her relationship with Bubblegum wasn't a fairy tale. It was work, compromise, two difficult people choosing each other despite difficulty. That representation mattered. That showed a generation that love doesn't require perfection, just commitment to working through imperfection together. She represented art as survival, music as coping mechanism, creation as response to destruction, beauty made from brutality. The axe bass wasn't just an instrument, it was a philosophy. Take what you're given, transform it, make it serve your purposes instead of its original design. Turn weapons into instruments, turn pain into songs, turn survival into meaning. She represented chosen family, Finn and Jake and BMO and Bubblegum. They weren't her blood relatives, but they were her family in ways that mattered more than genetics. She'd spent centuries alone because everyone biological in her life was either gone or insufficient. Finding people who chose to love her, who she chose to love back, who became family through shared experience rather than shared DNA, that was revolutionary for someone who'd learned to expect abandonment. Her ultimate arc was from isolated survivor to connected community member. From the girl wandering alone through post-apocalyptic ruins to the woman surrounded by people who knew her, loved her, challenged her to be better. From vampire queen of nothing to vampire queen who belonged somewhere, who had a place, who mattered to people beyond just being powerful or dangerous. She learned to let people in, even when everyone dies, even when love means loss, even when vulnerability guarantees eventual pain. She learned that connection was worth it, that surviving alone forever was worse than surviving with people and losing them. That immortality shared was better than immortality isolated, even if sharing meant grieving. She learned to be vulnerable when she was functionally indestructible. That was the real courage. Not fighting vampires or surviving the apocalypse or standing up to Golb. Those were just supernatural threats. The real bravery was letting Bubblegum see her cry, letting Simon know she'd been devastated by his loss, letting Finn and Jake matter to her when she knew they'd die eventually. Opening yourself to hurt when you'll live forever to remember that hurt, that required more strength than any battle. Finding home not in places but in people. That was Marceline's journey. She'd had houses, territories, caves decorated with pre-war artifacts, but none of them were home until they contained people who loved her. Home was Bubblegum's lab where Marceline floated while PB worked. Home was jam sessions with Finn and Jake. Home was reluctant visits to Simon while he figured out Post-Ice King existence. Home was wherever the people she'd chosen to love were choosing to love her back. The adventure never truly ended. That was the point of Adventure Time. The thesis of endings are optional, closure is negotiable. The story continues as long as you keep existing. Marceline would keep floating through eternity, but she wasn't floating alone anymore. She had companionship for the journey. She had love that lasted as long as her immortality. She had music to make and people to make it for and reasons to keep being alive beyond just surviving. She was still the Vampire Queen. Still carried darkness, still had complicated relationships with her father and her demon nature and her past. Still floated upside down and sucked the red from strawberries and played her bass at 3 a.m. Still her, completely and unapologetically. But she was also more than the Vampire Queen. She was Marceline, daughter of chaos who chose kindness, survivor who chose vulnerability, vampire who chose not to drink blood, immortal who chose to love mortals, the girl with the stuffed animal who became the woman with the bass guitar. She'd survived 1,000 years by being isolated. She'd learned to thrive by letting that isolation end. Time is an illusion that helps things make sense, and we're always living in the present tense. Marceline understood that now. She existed in all her moments simultaneously, the child with Simon, the vampire hunter, the heartbroken ex-girlfriend, the woman fighting Golb, the musician playing for people she loved. All of it was permanent. All of it was present. All of it was her. The pink and the grey, science and chaos, princess and queen, Bubblegum and Marceline together, figuring out forever one day at a time. Marceline floated in Bubblegum's lab, bass guitar strapped across her chest, eating the red off a strawberry and leaving the rest to fall. She'd done this for 1,000 years. Same floating, same bass, same strawberry trick, but different now. Different because Bubblegum was there, working at her microscope, occasionally looking up to smile at the vampire floating in her space. Different because she wanted to be there, chose to be there, had people to be there for. The bass guitar hummed with demonic energy converted to sound, with inherited darkness made into chosen light, with chaos organized into melody. Marceline played a riff, dark and light simultaneously, complicated and simple, past and present merged into music. She looked 17. She was 1,017. She was every age she'd ever been and also eternally just this moment, floating and playing and being exactly what she'd chosen to become. The vampire queen who chose kindness, the demon's daughter who chose love, the survivor who chose to keep surviving because people made it worthwhile. Bubblegum glanced up from her microscope. What are you playing?" "Something new," Marceline replied. "Something about staying. About choosing to stay even when staying is hard. About finding people worth staying for." "I like it. Play it again." So Marceline played it again, and Bubblegum listened, and the adventure continued as it always would, as it always had. In the land of Ooh, where everything was weird and magical and broken and beautiful. The Vampire Queen played her bass. The Candy Princess worked her microscope. Two immortals in love, sharing forever, making eternity bearable through the simple act of being together. Sometimes wanting to go where everybody knows your name means building the place yourself, finding the people. Becoming the person they know. Creating home from chaos and family from choice and meaning from survival. Marceline had survived everything. Now she was learning to do more than survive. She was learning to live. And that, finally, after 1,000 years. That was the adventure that mattered most. The bass sang in the lab. Marceline sang with it. The songs continued. The story continued. The girl who'd lived forever found reasons to keep living. Everything stays, but it still changes. Marceline stayed, and she was finally, blessedly, gratefully changed by it. The adventure continues. It always does. Forever and ever, in the land of Ooh, where nothing makes sense and everything matters and love is real and immortality is bearable when shared. Marceline floated. Bubblegum smiled. The bass guitar played on. And somewhere in the melody, in the space between notes, in the shared eternity of two immortals who'd chosen each other, that's where the real adventure lived. Not in fighting or surviving or accumulating centuries, but in the quiet moments. The music, the love, the choice to stay when staying is hard but staying together makes it worthwhile. The Vampire Queen had survived 1,000 years. Now she was learning to live them. That was everything. That was enough. That was home. The song played on. The adventure continued. And Marceline finally, after everything, was not alone.